Audiobook, Cuba, Metamorphosis of a Republic. By Milco Baute. Written and published in 2019. Prologue. By Dr. Pastor Chaplain Marcos A. Toyens. My brother and friend, the writer Milco Baute, who is also my editor, has managed to reflect in this book, based on his personal research, experience, and the testimonies of others, how the transformation or deformation of a republic occurred, a nation once considered a model and example for all of Latin America in terms of progress, culture, education, and achievements. The Pearl of the Antilles has deteriorated due to a 6-decade-long tyranny, and its decline is evident in the photos he shows us, those who knew the island before Castro and now know from personal experience how political, moral, cultural, and spiritual decay has taken place. I am a pastor and chaplain from Puerto Rico and also a U.S. citizen. I've had the opportunity to visit several countries on the continent during evangelistic missions. I've been to nations in conflict, slums, and the worst prisons in Latin America, but seeing how the condition of the island of Cuba has worsened saddens me even more, because it is not a country in armed or social conflict, nor is it suffering a legitimate economic blockade, but rather an embargo imposed in the 1960s as a response by the U.S. government to the expropriations carried out by the Cuban regime and the plundering of all confiscated properties. In truth, however, the Cuban government has always negotiated with developing countries, especially with the Soviet Union, but once it stopped depending on that superpower, they began to blame the American embargo for everything. Cubans are entrepreneurial and bright people, and many long for the freedom of their homeland. Even though I have not lived in Cuba, I know its history well. At this moment, politicians in Puerto Rico are trying to copy the Cuban Castro-style model. In my case, as a spiritual advisor and political counselor, with the influence I have in the politics of my land, and where I may run for governor, I have educated myself and studied the Cuban case thoroughly. I congratulate my brother Milco for this work, in which he seeks to demonstrate what Cuban life is like, how a humble and talented people have suffered, where hundreds of thousands have emigrated clandestinely, risking their own lives, many have succeeded, and many perished at sea. The Cuban exodus has flowed more than ever since 1959, and due to my age, I know people from the U.S. and Puerto Rico who once emigrated to Cuba before the Castro tyranny, because they considered it a tropical paradise. I hope this book raises awareness and clarifies the minds of those who have doubts or believe what the communists say about Cuba. Communism has done great harm to humanity from the beginning of the 20th century to this day, and the Cuban regime has always sought to unify Latin America to export its communist revolution, destabilizing the region with expansionist ambitions. Latin America can be like one people and as brothers collaborate and help each other in everything, but it does not have to be a communist people, controlled by corrupt and wicked tyrants. God bless Cuba and have mercy on that beloved island. God bless my island of Puerto Rico and keep it from falling into such disgrace. And God bless the United States of America, our elder brother, who watches over the continent, model and example for the whole world of Christian faith, principles, values, patriotism, liberty, prosperity, progress, achievements, technology, science, art, and more. A nation blessed by God and a blessing to the entire world. Preface. As a free thinker and citizen in freedom, born and raised in Cuba, where I spent the first 28 years of my life, and having lived under Castro-style socialism from birth until I was able to legally leave the island for the United States of America, where I have been a citizen since 2001 and to which I owe what my country of origin denied me, I have taken on the task of exposing in this book how the Republic of Cuba has undergone a transformation, metamorphosis, and social decay due to all the time spent in captivity, for Cuba is a slave island, hijacked by rebels who took up arms and overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista, who did not resign or lose, but cowardly fled the country, leaving the Pearl of the Antilles at the mercy of the rebel army. These revolutionaries, led by Fidel Castro, later became their executioners, committing worse atrocities than the regime they had fought against, holding the population captive for 6 decades. I will begin by recounting how a republic emerged after gaining independence from the Spanish crown, supported by the history documented in the virtual encyclopedia, continuing up to the year 1959, according to historical records. Then I will focus on the life of Cubans over these last 6 decades under the Castro communist regime, based on my own testimony, having lived nearly 30 years on the island under that regime, and on the testimony and documentation of others. The purpose of this work is to remind many of what they intend to forget and to clarify for others what they think Cuba is, what socialism is, and what life is like for Cuban citizens on the island. For those who think Cuba is a free and sovereign country, they are far from the truth, or do not clearly understand the concept of freedom and sovereignty. Cuba is not what the regime portrays or wants people to believe. Cuba has gone from being the most prosperous country in Latin America to being the poorest, and this has been the case for a long time. Free healthcare and education are nothing more than communist propaganda, and I will explain why. Cuba is not a powerhouse of anything, although it has had many achievements, because Cubans are and always have been enterprising and talented. Cuba has always produced great doctors, scientists, writers, artists, athletes, and professionals. This cannot be credited to any government, because governments do not create people. Man is the creation of God, and virtues, gifts, and talents are distributed by God as He wills. Some use them for good, others for evil, for personal gain, or to become accomplices to dictatorships, as has been the case throughout history, in any country in the world. Today, Cuba competes with Venezuela in terms of political social decay and misery, although the famine in Venezuela has now surpassed that of Cuba, partly because Venezuela has a puppet government under the Cuban regime, with a population of over 30 million people, which is harder to feed and manage than Cuba's population of just over 11 million. This is due to the centralized nature of the socialist government, which controls and distributes all resources. But in truth, hunger and famine are old communist strategies, so that the population cannot organize or fight back, since their only struggle is to find daily bread and try to survive another year. History repeats itself, and it will continue to do so in every country that adopts and establishes a socialist model. Eventually, they will end up in a dictatorship, if allowed, after unifying executive, judicial, and legislative powers, centralizing or socializing the economy, education, health, public services, culture, and sports, rewarding those who comply and persecuting and repressing those who oppose. They transform everything to deform it according to the whims of their corrupt and perverse rulers, those modern-day pharaohs. This has always been the case and always will be. It happened in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, and every republic where this model has been applied. Some countries have managed to rid themselves of these dictatorial and corrupt socio-political systems, such as Russia, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Angola, Vietnam, etc., but others have fallen into the trap offered by 21st-century socialism, or whatever they want to call it, with the same utopia, the same demagoguery, and the same circumstances that lead to the empowerment of corrupt, wicked, and unscrupulous men or women. The end of the Cuban dictatorship and the restoration of the republic, no one knows when that will come, only God knows. But we Cubans are mainly to blame for having allowed its prolongation, with the destruction and degeneration of such a beautiful country. In my book, The Cuba Case and the Stockholm Syndrome, I explain the reasons why God has allowed the Cuban tragedy to continue for so long, becoming the longest dictatorship in modern history. Both Cubans on the island and those who emigrate have resigned themselves to living in captivity, because even many living in other countries have become satisfied slaves with an oppressed Cuba, becoming accomplices to their executioners and dictators. All they think about is traveling, returning, buying goods, and taking them to Cuba. Cubans on the island don't speak up, they don't care about politics, who oppresses them, or how to get out of that depressing situation. They have come to believe that everything must be earned, they've got used to double standards, to living without complaining, to managing however they can, and even to committing to the system if necessary, just to survive and get ahead. Cubans don't know what freedom is, and many don't even care. Patriots are becoming fewer and fewer, and dissidents have become martyrs with no support from their people, from global public opinion, from foreign powers, from the United Nations, or from any human rights organization, because they don't see genuine interest from the citizens themselves for a free Cuba. With only a handful of dissidents, there can be no change, no push or pressure for a democratic transition. Sadly, many public figures, politicians, celebrities, and influential people of Cuban descent have thrown in the towel and no longer speak out against the dictatorship. Many have even become its accomplices and defenders, using the excuse that, "we are one people." And what about the influential Cuban artists who live in Cuba, who travel, and even those who emigrate? They continue defending the Cuban system, the oppressor, and sending foreign currency that prolongs the regime's control, actively participating in the dictatorship. On the other hand, the Vatican has also become an accomplice, along with the ruling globalist elite and all the entities they manage and support, such as the UN, the OAS, the International Monetary Fund, etc. It is convenient for them to have dictatorships, to prevent most nations from prospering, to keep them low profile, so that there are more poor people, to make themselves richer. Today, socialism has become very popular because it is a system of control, and for this globalist elite to control all nations and the planet's wealth and resources, they need to have totalitarian governments that dominate their populations. Globalism is essentially the ideology of the New World Order, something like a modern fascism stemming from the left. I explain this in more detail in my book, Globalism and the New World Order, also available online. The Birth of a Republic and its Trajectory until 1959. The Republic of Cuba from 1902 to 1959, referred to by the current Cuban government as the Neo-Colonial Republic and by dissident Cubans as Free Cuba, refers to the first Cuban state that existed after the end of the U.S. occupation of the island on May 20, 1902, interrupted by another occupation between 1906 and 1909, until the triumph of the Cuban Revolution on January 1, 1959, which established a socialist state. Cuba's independence was allowed by the Platt Amendment in 1901. Although nominally a de jure representative democracy, in reality, there was significant political instability, and there were several military governments and coups throughout pre-revolutionary history due to the immense influence of the United States over the country. During this period, Cuba was often considered a puppet state or a de facto colony of the United States. In 1934, a treaty was signed between the Cuban and U.S. governments that obligated Cuba to give the U.S. preferential treatment in its economic policy. In return, the U.S. granted Cuba 22% of the sugar market quota, which was later modified to 49% in 1949. In 1933, a coup led by Fulgencio Batista overthrew the authoritarian government of Gerardo Machado, who had ruled dictatorially since 1925. From that point on, for the next 2 decades, Batista would dominate almost the entire political life of the country. In 1940, after a decade of political instability, a new semi-presidential constitution was drafted and came into effect on October 10 of that year. The Constituent Assembly consisted of 76 delegates representing 9 political parties. With this new Magna Carta, which incorporated important popular demands, a new period of institutional legality began, and it was considered one of the most advanced constitutions of its time. The first government under this new constitution was led by Fulgencio Batista, whose candidacy had been supported by a coalition that included the communists. During Batista's administration, the economy improved due to the outbreak of World War II, a situation that would benefit his successor even more, Ramón Grau San Martín, who was elected in 1944 thanks to the broad popular support he gained from the nationalist and democratic measures implemented during his previous administration. However, neither Grau nor Carlos Prio Socarrás, 1948 to 1952, both leaders of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, authentic, were able to take advantage of the favorable economic conditions during their terms. Both governments were characterized by political repression and the successive assassinations of opposition leaders. Some members of the Authentic Party, dissatisfied with the direction of these administrations, founded the Cuban People's Party, Orthodox, in 1947 under the leadership of Eduardo Chivas as a breakaway from the Authentic Party. The Orthodox Party promised to fulfill the promises that had been betrayed by the Authentics, and Chivas' charisma played a decisive role in public acceptance. In 1952, Batista ran again as a candidate for the presidential election scheduled for that year. However, since polls placed him in third place, on March 10, he carried out a coup d'état that overthrew Carlos Prio Socarrás and established a military dictatorship. Once in power, Batista abolished the 1940 Constitution and suspended political freedoms, including the right to strike. He allied himself with the island's wealthy landowners who owned the largest sugar plantations and presided over a stagnant economy that widened the gap between rich and poor Cubans. Batista's increasingly corrupt and repressive government began systematically enriching itself by exploiting Cuba's commercial interests and engaging in lucrative dealings with the American mafia, which controlled drug, prostitution, and gambling businesses in Havana. In an attempt to quell the growing discontent of the people, which often manifested through strikes and student protests, Batista tightened censorship on the media and increased the repression of communists through indiscriminate violence, torture, and executions that cost the lives of around 20,000 people. From 1956 to 1958, the July 26 movement, with a communist ideology and led by Fidel Castro, spearheaded resistance against Batista's repression through urban and rural guerrilla warfare. This culminated in the final defeat of the dictatorial regime by the rebels, led by Che Guevara, in the Battle of Santa Clara, fought on December 31, 1958. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the island, and the new socialist regime officially took power, replacing the 1940 Constitution on February 7 with a fundamental law that would govern the country provisionally. Although Castro initially promised a return to the 1940 Constitution in early elections, by 1976, a clearly socialist constitution was adopted, making Cuba a one-party state dominated by the Communist Party of Cuba and permanently ending the previous regime. Independence and U.S. occupation. The Cuban War of Independence, which began in 1895, was followed by a short period of self-government, until 1898 when the Spanish Empire ceded its overseas possessions to the United States through the Treaty of Paris. The government of Washington quickly dismantled the weakened Spanish army and did not recognize the Republic of Cuba in arms, even preventing Cuban troops from entering the city of Santiago de Cuba. The country was completely devastated. Cities and countryside were filled with starving families due to the Spanish reconcentration policy, job sources were extremely limited, and some of the liberators even lost the properties they had before the war. On January 1, 1899, the U.S. occupation of Cuba officially began under a government issuing military orders. While other territories such as the Philippines, which gained independence in 1946, and Puerto Rico and Guam, still U.S. territories, remained occupied, Cuban pressure accelerated the process toward nominal independence. The Constituent Assembly drafted and approved the Liberal Democratic Constitution of 1901. The 1901 Constitution contained the classic parts of all constitutions, the dogmatic portion relating to individual rights, as enshrined by the French Revolution, the organic portion relating to the structure, functions, and authority of the state organization, and the Reform Clause, Article 115. Essentially, it established a republican and representative regime, structured on Montesquieu's famous separation of powers. The legislative branch consisted of a Senate and a House of Representatives, a bicameral system, and a judiciary with relative independence. Its members were immovable, though their appointments often depended on the executive and sometimes the legislature. As part of this constitution, the Assembly was required to provide for and agree with the U.S. government on the nature of relations between the two governments. During the Assembly's deliberations on future U.S.-Cuba relations, the U.S. Congress approved the Platt Amendment, granting the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs whenever it deemed appropriate. Despite opposition from many delegates in the Constituent Assembly, American pressure, presenting Cubans with the choice of either an independent republic under the Platt Amendment or continued U.S. occupation, led to its final approval by the Cuban Assembly on June 12, 1901. Government of Tomás Estrada Palma and Second Occupation. After the Platt Amendment was approved, the U.S. government proceeded with the decolonization of Cuba. On May 20, 1902, the Republic of Cuba was officially declared, and Tomás Estrada Palma, former president of the Republic of Cuba in arms, was elected as its first president. Estrada Palma's prestige among revolutionary circles made him one of the favorite candidates among broad sectors of the Cuban population. The existing division worsened after the failure of the proposed candidacy of Máximo Gómez, in which Estrada Palma would be president and Bartolomé Masso, who had been the last president of the Republic in arms, would be vice president. This first government would have the task of formalizing Cuba's dependent ties with the United States. To that end, several agreements were signed during this administration. The Commercial Reciprocity Treaty of 1902, under which Cuban products received a 20% tariff reduction upon entering the U.S., and U.S. products received a 20% to 40% reduction upon entering Cuba. The 1903 Naval and Coaling Stations Lease Agreement, under Article 7 of the Platt Amendment, which granted the United States the right to lease land for bases in Bahia Honda and Guantanamo. Estrada Palma's government and the treaties with the U.S. faced strong opposition, including writer Enrique Collazo, who denounced political and administrative corruption. Salvador Cisneros Betancourt, who labeled the government anti-democratic. Manuel Sanguilli, who criticized the 1902 Reciprocity Treaty, U.S. investments, and the sale of Cuban land to Americans. This discontent triggered the Liberal Party's revolt, leading to events that prompted another U.S. intervention under Article 3 of the Platt Amendment. From 1906 to 1909, the island was under U.S. administration again, this time under a civilian facade, preserving Cuban national symbols on public buildings. The occupation was led by American lawyer Charles Edward Magoon, who helped create the permanent Cuban army to avoid future occupations. First governments, José Miguel Gómez and Mario García Menécal. On November 14, 1908, José Miguel Gómez, of the Liberal Party, won the presidential elections with 60% of the vote. After the U.S. occupation officially ended, he assumed the presidency of the Republic of Cuba on January 28, 1909, for a 4-year term. His administration attempted to bring peace to the country, confronting the veterans, a group determined to prevent former independence fighters from taking administrative posts, and the uprising of the Independent Party of Color, which fought for racial equality and recognition for black Cubans in the new society. This movement culminated in the armed uprising of the Independence of Color, in which thousands of black Cubans rose against social discrimination. The Cuban army responded by massacring between 300 and 500 rebels, according to various sources, while only 12 casualties were reported on the army's side. His government was highly criticized for certain public service concessions and for controversial laws of the time, such as legalizing cockfighting and the national lottery, as well as for scandals of corruption and favoritism, issues that would characterize the country throughout its Republican history. Despite its corruption, his administration managed to preserve the democratic system that governed the country for approximately the next 15 years. In 1913, after the 1912 elections, Gómez was succeeded by Mario García Menécal, of the Conservative Party, who became known for his strong support of businesses and corporations. He was re-elected in 1916, though the election results were contested by the Liberals. On April 7, 1917, García Menécal declared war on the German Empire, entering World War I one day after the United States did. In December of that year, he also declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Alfredo Zayas and the First Reforms. In 1920, candidate Alfredo Zayas, who had participated in the 1916 elections, defeated José Miguel Gómez. Zayas assumed power in 1921, but he found the country in bankruptcy, with debts exceeding $40 million, and the price of sugar having plummeted from 23 to 3 cents per pound. Zayas did not seek re-election, but during his 4-year presidency, he promoted women's rights, especially women's suffrage, and made reforms in education and social security. However, corruption during his term sparked confrontations with various sectors of society, the most notable being the Protest of the 13. He negotiated the return of Cuban sovereignty over the Isle of Pines, Isla de la Juventud, 3,056 square kilometers, which had been occupied by the United States since 1898. To revive the economy devastated by his predecessor, Zayas obtained a $50 million loan from J.P. Morgan. He was also the first president to allow freedom of the press without censorship. Dictatorship of Gerardo Machado. Elected democratically in 1924 and re-elected in 1928, Gerardo Machado later became Cuba's first dictator, before being overthrown in 1933. After nearly 15 years of democratic rule, in 1925, General Gerardo Machado of the Liberal Party took office. His campaign slogan was, "Water, Roads, and Schools." During his administration, major infrastructure projects were completed, including the capital of Havana, the Central Highway, and various economic achievements. His new regime attempted to reconcile the interests of the national bourgeoisie and American capital in its economic policies, offering stability to the middle class and jobs to the popular sectors. However, this was combined with selective but fierce repression against political opponents and dissident movements. Machado's economic program focused on reducing foreign investments, cutting sugar production to raise international prices, a tariff reform to increase taxes on foreign products that Cuba could produce domestically, example, coffee, rice, eggs, meats. A public works plan aimed at reducing unemployment by creating jobs. Under the appearance of administrative efficiency, the government attempted to suppress the rivalry among traditional parties by offering them access to the state budget through a cooperative formula. Machado pressured all parties to support his government, initially with partial success. With this temporary consensus, Machado reformed the constitution to extend his power for 6 more years. His rule became increasingly repressive, with arrests, torture, and the murders of leaders such as Alfredo López and Julio Antonio Mella. The Confederación Nacional Obrera de Cuba, CNOC, was banned, and an atmosphere of terror and persecution spread across the revolutionary movement. This resulted in a generalized crisis, exacerbated by the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933, which worsened Cuba's economic situation and heightened popular discontent. Almost every social sector organized to oppose Machado, including right-wing groups like the Unión Nacionalista led by Carlos Mendieta, center groups like the University Student Directory, left-wing groups like the CNOC, the Communist Party, the Revolutionary Union of Antonio Guterres, and the leftist student wing. Even fascist-inspired groups like the ABC, a secret armed organization. The 1930 general strike and fall of Machado. On March 20, 1930, a general strike took place, involving 200,000 workers under the slogan, "Down with Machado." Its main organizer was Rubén Martínez Villena, leader of the CNOC, National Workers' Confederation of Cuba. This strike is considered the beginning of the anti-Machado revolution, along with the student protest known as the Tangana of September 1933, which was a coordinated plan by university students to promote a popular uprising through public disorder. These actions culminated in August 1933 with another general strike, which began as a bus strike in Havana. What started as a partial economic strike quickly turned into a full political strike, resulting in Machado fleeing the country on August 12, 1933, under intense popular pressure. He was replaced by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y Quesada. Instability in the 1930s. On September 5, 1933, the Sergeants' Revolt, led by Sergeant Fulgencio Batista, overthrew the fragile interim government of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. An executive committee of 5 members, later known as the Pentarchy of 1933, was appointed to lead a provisional government. However, the Pentarchy was ousted by an organization led by university students, the Student Directory, and Ramón Grau San Martín was then appointed as provisional president. This administration was known as the 100 Days Government, headed by Ramón Grau as president and Antonio Guterres as Secretary of the Interior. It criticized and opposed the Platt Amendment and introduced numerous popular measures, including implementation of the 8-hour workday, land distribution to peasants, legalization of labor unions, granting of university autonomy, reduction of electricity rates, intervention in the U.S. electric company operating in Cuba. Grau resigned in 1934, after which Fulgencio Batista began to dominate Cuban politics for the next 25 years, initially through a succession of puppet presidents. The period from 1933 to 1937 was marked by practically unceasing social and political conflict. After the dismissal of Miguel Mariano Gómez in 1936, his vice president, Federico Laredo Bru, assumed the presidency while a new constitution was being drafted that would come into force before his term ended. Constitution of 1940. Carlos Prio Socaras would become the last democratically elected president of Cuba and the first Cuban head of state born after the country's independence. During the initial months of the Constituent Assembly, Ramón Grau San Martín of the Authentic Party served as president. After his resignation, he was replaced by Carlos Márquez Sterling of the Republican Action Party. On October 10, 1940, the Constitution of 1940 came into effect. The 1940 Constitution was heavily inspired by the Spanish Republic's Constitution of 1931 and contained 286 articles grouped into 19 titles. It introduced significant innovations compared to previous constitutions by granting constitutional status to institutions that had previously only been regulated by ordinary laws. For example, it constitutionally enshrined the family as a protected institution, declared equality between spouses, established the right to divorce, and codified the duties of parents regarding the assistance and education of children, whether born in or out of wedlock. Another important innovation was the constitutional recognition of labor rights. These included the right to work, a minimum wage, Social Security regulations, limits on daily working hours, paid rest periods, and protections for working mothers. It was considered one of the most progressive constitutions of its time, had it been fully applied. The first president under this new constitution was Fulgencio Batista. During his first term, he cooperated with the Allies in World War II, declaring war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. He even referred to Francisco Franco's regime in Spain as fascist and urged the United Nations and other Latin American countries to declare war on Spain as well, without success. In 1944, new elections were held, and Ramón Grau San Martín was re-elected. The sugar industry had been severely affected by deteriorating Cuba-U.S. relations during 1939, although the new treaty signed on December 27, 1939, improved the situation by re-establishing a quota system for the industry. Governments of Grau and Prio Socaras. During Batista's administration, the economy experienced improvement due to the onset of World War II. This economic upswing would benefit his successor, Ramón Grau San Martín, who was elected in 1944, supported by broad popular backing due to the nationalist and democratic reforms he had introduced during his earlier presidency. However, neither Grau nor Carlos Prio Socaras, 1948–1952, both leaders of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, Authentic, were able to capitalize on the favorable economic conditions of their respective terms. Both administrations were marked by political repression, including the assassinations of opposition leaders such as labor leaders Jesus Menéndez and Aracilio Iglesias. They also implemented harsh press censorship through the infamous gag law, Ley Mordeza, and promoted the formation of gangster groups that took over the drug trade, prostitution, and illegal gambling industries. Some members of the Authentic Party, disillusioned with the direction of the government, founded the Cuban People's Party, Orthodox, in 1947, led by Eduardo Chibas, as a breakaway faction. The Orthodox Party received widespread popular support due to its promises to fight corruption and restore integrity. Carlos Prio Socaras, nicknamed the Cordial President, was committed to a civic regime, especially in terms of respecting freedom of expression. His administration succeeded in launching several public works projects, establishing a national bank and an audit court. However, political violence between factions and repeated allegations of theft and personal enrichment within the government undermined Prio's presidency. His administration increasingly came to be seen by the public as ineffective in curbing both corruption and violence, just as Grau's had been before him. Batista's coup. After 8 years of constitutional government under the presidencies of Ramón Grau San Martín and Carlos Prio Socaras, Fulgencio Batista was once again a candidate in the 1952 elections. However, some polls showed him trailing behind Roberto Agramont of the Orthodox Party and Carlos Javia of the Authentic Party. As a result, on March 10, 1952, just 4 months before the scheduled presidential elections, Batista staged another coup d'état, citing poorly justified reasons. Using his influence in the armed forces and support from certain political sectors, he deposed Carlos Prio Socarrás, cancelled the elections, and imposed himself as provisional president. The coup was bloodless but caused great concern and alarm among the population. To legitimize his dictatorship, Batista organized fraudulent elections on November 1, 1954, in which he ran as a candidate representing a coalition of the Progressive Action Party, the Radical Union Party, and the Liberal Party. The opposition was divided between abstentionists, who called for a total boycott of the elections under any circumstances, and electoralists, who sought fair conditions and guarantees in order to participate. Batista used blackmail, intimidation, and electoral fraud to win at any cost. As a result, nearly all political parties withdrew their candidates and joined the boycott. Former President Ramón Grau San Martín launched a brief campaign but withdrew just days before the vote, accusing Batista of fraud and stating that his supporters were being threatened and terrorized. Batista was then declared the winner with 45.6% of the votes, in an election with 52.6% voter turnout. Cuba's economy and Batista's regime. When Batista took power, he inherited a country that was relatively prosperous by Latin American standards. Cuba was one of the most developed countries in the region. In the 1950s, Cuba's GDP per capita was approximately equal to that of Italy, according to Batista government figures, although still only 1/6 that of the United States. On the other hand, Batista's government respected the rights of U.S. industries and Cuban-American trade, and industrial workers' wages rose significantly. According to the International Labour Organization, in 1958, Cuba had the 8th highest industrial wage in the world. However, corruption was massive, and despite various positive indicators, by 1953 the gap between the rich and poor was widening. The military government began to systematically enrich itself by exploiting Cuba's commercial interests and engaging in profitable deals with the American mafia, which had a stronghold over drugs, prostitution, and gambling operations in Havana. This led to a deep economic and social crisis in the country that would ultimately erupt into the Cuban Revolution. Cuban Revolution, 1953 to 1959. On July 26, 1953, just over a year after Batista's coup, a small group of revolutionaries attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Government forces quickly defeated the attackers, imprisoned their leaders, and others fled the country. The main leader of the attack, Fidel Castro, was a young lawyer who would have been a candidate in the 1952 parliamentary elections, had they not been cancelled by Batista's coup. Although Castro had not yet been officially nominated, he believed that Batista's actions had derailed a promising political career. Following the Moncada assault, Batista suspended constitutional guarantees, and from that point until the end of his government, the police maintained a state of repression and fear among the population. By late 1955, student uprisings and anti-Batista demonstrations had become frequent, and unemployment became a severe issue, especially for newly graduated youth unable to find stable jobs. The government responded with increased repression, treating nearly all youth as revolutionary suspects. Because of the growing revolutionary activity on campus, the University of Havana was closed on November 30, 1956, and did not reopen until after Batista was overthrown. On March 13, 1957, student leader José Antonio Echeverría was executed by police in front of Radio Reloj in Havana, shortly after falsely announcing that Batista had been killed during a failed assault on the presidential palace. In reality, Batista escaped, and the students of the Federation of University Students and the March 13 Revolutionary Directorate who led the attack were killed by military and police forces. Fidel Castro condemned the attack, as the July 26 movement had not participated in it. Coup attempt and weakening of the army. In April 1956, Batista summoned military officer Ramón Barcan back from the United States to assess the Dominican Republic's military capability to attack Cuba. At the time, both Batista and Dominican President Rafael Trujillo were facing serious political crises. Barcan was popular among the Cuban people, and Batista hoped that by associating with him, he might regain some public support. However, Barkin was secretly plotting Batista's overthrow in what became known as the Conspiracy of the Pure. On April 4, 1956, a coup attempt was launched but failed, due to betrayal by Lieutenant Rios Morajan, who revealed the plan to Batista. Barkin was sentenced to solitary confinement on the Isle of Pines, and some conspirators received death sentences for treason. However, many others involved in the plot remained unsanctioned within the military. The subsequent purge of the Cuban army seriously weakened its ability to fight Castro's guerrillas. Batista's police responded to the growing unrest with torture and killings, but they were ineffective against the guerrilla forces operating in the Sierra Maestra and Escambray Mountains. Another possible reason why Batista did not effectively move to eliminate Castro's rebels, as noted by writer Carlos Alberto Montaner, was that the dictatorship was embezzling funds meant for national defense, using the guerrilla threat as an excuse. Batista's regime was becoming increasingly unpopular, and the Soviet Union began secretly supporting Castro's guerrilla movement. Toward the end, even Cuban generals began to speak against Batista, as his constant interference in military planning weakened and disrupted the army's efforts against the rebellion. 1958 elections and collapse of Batista's regime. In November 1958, new elections were held, excluding the provinces of Los Villas and Orient, which were already under Castro's control by that time. The elections were originally scheduled for June, as required by the Constitution, but were postponed due to ongoing guerrilla activity. Just like in 1954, Ramon Grau again launched a candidacy but withdrew shortly before Election Day, citing fraud. His concerns were confirmed when Batista ordered a recount after the vote. The declared winner was Andrés Rivero Aguero, a candidate loyal to Batista. However, even though he was the legally elected president, he was never allowed to take office. Collapse of Batista's dictatorship and fall of the Republic. By late December 1958, the collapse of Batista's dictatorship appeared inevitable. Although the United States had supported Batista for years with planes, ships, and advanced weapons such as napalm, in March 1958, it announced a halt in arms sales to his government. Later that year, the U.S. imposed an arms embargo, which sealed the fate of Batista's fragile regime. By December, his only support came from landowners and Cuban businessmen who had benefited economically from the dictatorship. On December 28, guerrilla forces led by Che Guevara began the decisive battle for Santa Clara, the gateway to Havana and the final stronghold before the capital. On December 31, when the rebels captured an armored train that had been sent by the government to reinforce the city, Batista decided to flee, leaving the island for Santo Domingo in a plane that took off at 3 a.m. on January 1, 1959. He fled with President-elect Andrés Rivero Aguero, leaving the country virtually leaderless and under the temporary control of General Eulogio Cantillo. The next morning, the Second Front of the Escambray, commanded by Eloy Gutiérrez Manoyo, entered Havana. The following day, troops from the July 26 movement under Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara entered the Colombia military camp and La Cabana fortress, respectively, without resistance. Upon entering Camp Colombia, Cienfuegos removed Colonel Barkin from command and arrested General Cantillo. Shortly after, troops from the Revolutionary Directorate, led by Four Common, seized the presidential palace, which caused a power crisis among the revolutionary factions. Simultaneously, on January 1, Fidel Castro arrived in Santiago de Cuba, declared it the provisional capital, and proclaimed Magistrate Manuel Urrutia Leo as president. For the time being, the U.S. government recognized the revolutionary government as legitimate, formally ending Batista's dictatorship both de jure and de facto. On February 7, 1959, the fundamental law was enacted, which repealed the 1940 Constitution and placed Cuba under a provisional one-party government. Finally, in 1976, any hopes of restoring democratic governance were eliminated with the approval of a new socialist constitution, which officially transformed Cuba into a one-party state. Government and politics. Cuba's first constitution, adopted in 1901, came into force with the country's independence on May 20, 1902. Although it had been ready since February of the previous year, the United States delayed its ratification while drafting the Platt Amendment, which would limit Cuba's sovereignty. The 1901 Constitution guaranteed a representative democracy with a separation of powers, including a bicameral legislature composed of the Senate and House of Representatives, a presidential executive branch with broad powers, similar to the U.S. Constitution, a judiciary that was relatively independent in theory, although in practice it was largely subject to executive influence. The Constitution was not submitted to a referendum, and the Constituent Assembly limited itself to organizing elections under the newly drafted law. After the political instability of the 1930s, during the presidency of Federico Loredo Bru, elections were held for a Constituent Assembly, which drafted a new Magna Carta that reduced the president's powers and introduced the role of prime minister, making Cuba a semi-presidential republic. In its early months, the assembly was chaired by Ramon Grau San Martin of the Authentic Party, and after his resignation, Carlos Marquez Sterling of the Republican Action Party took over. The 1940 Constitution came into force on October 10, 1940. It introduced important labor and social protections, such as minimum wage laws, Social Security regulation, maximum working hours, paid leave, maternity protections. In general, the Constitution sought to establish a clearly nationalist character for the Republic, implement a more democratic and participatory system, enshrine newly declared human rights, combat corruption. At the time of its adoption, the 1940 Constitution was considered one of the most advanced in the world in terms of democracy and civil rights. After Batista's 1952 coup, the Constitution was suspended until the 1954 elections, but in practice, the regime had become presidential, authoritarian, fraudulent, and militaristic. One of the primary goals of the July 26 movement was to restore the 1940 Constitution. After the Cuban Revolution, the provisional government relied on it to draft the Fundamental Law of 1959, which gave nearly all power to the Prime Minister, Fidel Castro, and reduced the president to a mere head of state, while abolishing multi-party politics. Economy. Cuba's economy has always been deeply tied to sugar, which has been its main, and nearly only, export product since the beginning. After independence, this situation did not change much. Cuba remained heavily dependent on sugar, and its economy was closely linked to global sugar prices, as almost all the sugar produced was destined for export, primarily to the United States. Between 1920 and 1933, the island's exports and imports dropped from 60% to 50%. Several misfortunes caused this dramatic decline over just a decade. In 1920, the U.S., which had been purchasing enormous quantities of sugar to feed its World War I soldiers, no longer needed as much. By 1925, the U.S. began producing beet sugar domestically, which gradually replaced Cuban sugar. The situation worsened with the 1929 stock market crash, which further collapsed sugar demand. As sugar demand fell, so did its price, and Cuba began to lose purchasing power in global trade. This meant it had to sell more sugar to buy the same amount of foreign goods. For example, in 1900, Cuba might sell 1 ton of sugar to buy a car. By 1950, it had to sell 2 tons of sugar to buy the same car. After Batista's coup, his violent and corrupt dictatorship deepened the divide between rich and poor. The military government systematically enriched itself by exploiting Cuba's commercial interests and partnering with the American mafia, which controlled Havana's drug, prostitution, and gambling operations. This led to a deep economic and social crisis that eventually exploded into the Cuban Revolution. The 1960s. Although I was born in the 1960s, I cannot speak with certainty about how things really were in Cuba during that time, since I was born in 1967, and naturally, I also cannot fully describe the 1970s. Still, I recall many things from my childhood that marked me and made me realize how hard parents work to raise their children and the hardships of a lost childhood, without toys, games, or the kind of technology that even a poor child in another country could enjoy. However, based on the contributions of others and the memories of my parents, who have since passed, I will share how socialist Cuba was during the 1960s. The 1960s Decade, by Manuel Cerejo, Miami. The 1960s was the bloodiest decade in Cuban history. Crimes, firing squads, imprisonments, confiscations, theft, abuse, family separations, forced exile, expelled priests, university purges, unrestrained envy, and mobs shouting, "Perdón! Perdón!" To the wall, in the streets have no parallel on this continent. It was the decade when hundreds of young people were executed while shouting, "Viva Cristo Rey!" The decade when prison sentences ranged from 10 to 30 years, in isolation, with no communication, and with a press, and a world, completely indifferent to our cause. It was the decade of the attempt to eliminate the Catholic Church. Though not entirely successful, the regime managed to weaken it to an extreme. 132 priests were expelled without cause. Masses were obstructed, and those who practiced religion were systematically repressed. It was the decade of the Escambray Uprising, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy assassination, and the armed struggle against the regime. It was also the harsh era of exile, when hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled to a country with a different language, culture, and no infrastructure in place to welcome them, bringing only their children, no jobs, and leaving behind family, history, friends, traditions, and often their parents and grandparents. It was the decade of mass confiscation of farms, buildings, factories, shops, offices, pharmacies. Every private business was seized with no justification, no compensation, and through sheer brute force. It was also when Cuba initiated, planned, and organized international terrorism and military interventions in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and even the United States, efforts that continue to this day. During this time, training camps were set up to create terrorists and soldiers for foreign interventions. It was the decade in which all private, religious, and independent schools and universities were shut down and taken over. It was also the beginning of constant ideological indoctrination of children and youth. Cuba lived that decade at a feverish pace, mass rallies, parades, military drills, endless speeches, slogans, and an overwhelming flood of revolutionary rhetoric. During that time, the regime established militias, mandatory guard duties, committees for the defense of the revolution, CDRs, Federation of Cuban Women, FMC, Union of Young Communists, UJC, pioneer youth groups, school camps in the countryside, volunteer labor programs, state security, G2, the Communist Party of Cuba, PCC. This was the decade in which the system was consolidated, and the dictator made it clear to the people that there would be no other power but his own, and that the rule of law had ceased to exist. That decade cannot be forgotten by Cubans, and to the younger generations who were born during or after it, we must remind them over and over again. The La Cuba explosion, conspiracy or excuse for U.S. intervention. Nothing is hidden that will not be revealed, nor secret that will not be made known. If the truth remains hidden on earth, it will be revealed in heaven before the throne of God on Judgment Day. For now, all we can do is listen to testimonies. Why the PCC ordered the explosion of the ship La Cuba. By Esteban M. Benavides. On March 4, 1960, at 3:39 p.m., the French ship La Cuba exploded at the Pan-American or Talapedra docks in the port of Havana. The ship was carrying weapons and explosives for the Cuban government. The incident resulted in 54 deaths and more than 345 injuries, according to government reports. At the funeral, during the official farewell, Prime Minister Fidel Castro accused the United States of being responsible for the explosion of La Cuba. This accusation continued for several weeks through regime-controlled media. But let us examine how the explosion occurred, who undoubtedly caused it, and their reasons. The Cuban Communist Party, PCC, ordered the ship's destruction due to the prevailing anti-communist sentiment in Cuba, which was growing daily. Those who lived in Cuba at the time understand this, but for those who didn't, or who have little memory, it's important to present a brief summary of the political and social climate in January and February of 1960. The Cuban people's anti-communist sentiment had reached its peak. The despair was such that executions, confiscations, and abuses by so-called revolutionary authorities led to increased resistance. The Diario de la Marina summarized the national mood with these four theses. Democracy yes, communism no. Sacrifice for Cuba yes, for Moscow no. Social justice yes, class warfare no. Catholicism yes, communism no. The Cuban government's increasingly totalitarian direction had provoked immense public outrage. Firing squads continued, revolutionary tribunals functioned daily, and thousands were sentenced to 20 or 30 years in prison, while thousands more were detained. In just those 2 months, among the numerous confiscations and nationalizations, the regime had seized the Aracabala distillery, 5 transportation companies, 10 match companies, 9 ships in Nuevadas, fishing assets in Pinar del Rio, textile factories, gypsum factories, agricultural assets. 70,000 acres from Menotti Sugar Company. 27 sugar mills. Dozens of other industrial and commercial entities. Explosions rocked Havana daily, and cane field burnings were frequent across the island. The PCC knew it needed to redirect anti-communist rage into anti-American nationalism, and the explosion of La Cuba was the perfect opportunity. But they needed it to appear as an act of Yankee imperialism, as a prelude to a U.S. invasion, supposedly aimed at reclaiming American-owned properties in Cuba. Anastas Mikoyan, vice premier of the USSR, had visited Havana days earlier and was likely not unaware of this plot. They sought to create a narrative similar to that of the USS Maine, using the explosion of La Cuba to generate international sympathy. José Pardo Lada, a regime propagandist, spent weeks on the radio declaring that the Maine had also been destroyed by the U.S. to justify intervention, and that the same was now happening with La Cuba. This narrative was picked up by the international liberal press, casting the Cuban regime as the victim. But we were all far from the truth, and from the Communist Party's dark schemes. How the explosion was prepared. According to testimonies gathered by Esteban M. Benavides, the destruction of La Cuba was planned by the Communist Party and executed by experienced guerrilla agents, with full knowledge of Soviet representatives and approval from Fidel Castro. The operation was organized to serve several purposes. Justify increased repression under the pretext of internal sabotage or imperialist threats. Mobilize public opinion against the United States, linking the explosion to supposed CIA intervention. Provoke international sympathy by portraying the Cuban regime as a victim of foreign aggression. Cement anti-American sentiment among the Cuban population and suppress the growing rejection of communism. Soon after the explosion, Castro himself delivered a dramatic public speech at the funeral of the victims, famously declaring, "Patria o muerte, venceremos." Meaning, fatherland or death, we shall overcome. This slogan became the official cry of the Cuban Revolution, symbolizing unconditional submission to the regime and the demonization of dissent as betrayal of the nation. The explosion's aftermath. The explosion of La Cuba not only caused dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries, but it also enabled the regime to accelerate the militarization of civil society. Enforce absolute media censorship, blaming only foreign enemies. Boost indoctrination efforts in schools and workplaces. Increase mass executions and arbitrary imprisonment. Label all anti-communists as agents of the CIA or traitors to the revolution. It marked a turning point in Cuba's political history, intensifying the country's shift toward totalitarian communism. While the truth behind the explosion may never be officially recognized, testimonies, independent research, and the patterns of manipulation seen in other totalitarian regimes all point to the Cuban Communist Party's involvement. On May 8, 1960, Cuba established relations with the Soviet Union, and months later with several socialist countries, among them, Czechoslovakia, May 16, 1960, Poland, June 15, 1960, Socialist Republic of Romania, October 1960, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, September 24, 1960, Mongolia, December 9, 1960, People's Socialist Republic of Albania, December 15, 1960, Hungary, December 18, 1960, Socialist Republic of Vietnam, December 1960. Already with the unwavering support of the Soviet Union, confiscations increased, and thus, on October 13, 1960, through Law No. 890, 104 sugar mills and 18 distilleries were nationalized. Also confiscated were 5 breweries, 3 soap and perfume factories, 6 dairy product derivative companies, 2 chocolate factories, 1 flour mill, 8 packaging factories, 4 paint factories, 7 paper companies, 1 lamp factory, 61 textile factories, 15 rice mills, 2 oil and fat companies, 47 grocery warehouses, 11 coffee roasters, 3 drugstores, 13 department stores, 8 railroad companies, 1 printing house, 11 film circuits with their cinemas, 19 construction consortiums, 1 electricity company, 13 maritime companies, 3 chemical factories, 7 basic metallurgical plants, 7 food product companies. See Cuba, Historical Yearbook 1960, Volumes 1 and 2. Prime Minister Fidel Castro Ruz participated in these deliberations. He approved and ordered the execution of the La Cuba Value Plan, due to the advantages it would bring to the party and the regime. In this way, once again, Fidel Castro Ruz and the party leadership did not hesitate before committing mass crime to achieve their goals. With this, Castro obtained the unconditional obedience of the communists and unity with the communist bloc, to support the regime. And thus, mutually, Castro and the party, with its clique, joined in the planning of an assassination to stay in power. And on October 9, with the capture of most of the patriots who had risen up in the Escambray and the execution of hundreds of them, the regime began to consolidate its power. This consolidation continued with the help of so many who have forgotten the suffering of a people who cry out for justice and long to live in peace, as a family, and with the love of all their brethren. Source, Diario Las Americas. Thursday, February 11, 1999. This and other excellent articles by the same author appear in the Guaracabia magazine. Operation Peter Pan, the story of 14,000 children who flew out of Cuba. By Diego Urdaneta. AFP, December 22, 2015. When the revolution was still young, Javier Lorenz was one of thousands of unaccompanied children who left Cuba for the United States, thinking it would be temporary. Only 5 years later he was able to reunite with his parents. Today, at 64 years old, he shares his bittersweet experience in camps that were set up in the American state of Florida to receive part of the 14,000 children who arrived in an exodus known as Operation Peter Pan, which began 55 years ago, on December 26, 1960, and lasted until 1962. It was very hard, but also very positive. I don't see how I could be the person I am today without having gone through that crisis, says Lorenz, now a married dentist with 2 daughters. But at the time of his departure, he was a child forced to separate from his parents and travel to an unknown country with his 16-year-old brother on August 15, 1962. I remember I had a really bad cold, with a fever, but we had to leave. We had been preparing for months and months, we had to summon the courage and pretend we didn't notice anything wrong, because if you had any setbacks, they'd take you off the plane, he says. Loren's parents made the difficult decision out of fear of indoctrination by the socialist revolution led by Fidel Castro, a fear that spread among other families. When Fidel Castro's government came to power in Cuba in 1959, everything changed. They started to cancel individual freedoms, freedom of the press, and began to take away people's property, says Eloisa Acazabal, who arrived at age 13 in Miami on September 6, 1961, along with her younger sister and 3 little cousins. What broke the camel's back for my parents was when the government took control of private and religious schools and began teaching communism in public schools, Acazabal says. Approximately half of the minors who arrived in the United States were received by relatives or friends at the airport, according to the Operation Pedro Pan Group Incorporated, which documents the stories of those who participated in the program. The U.S. government helped by extending a visa exemption for Cuban children. To shelter the rest, an Irish priest, Brian Walsh, coordinated a support network with temporary camps in Miami and Catholic orphanages in other states. Akazabal and her sister went to an orphanage in New York State, where she later lived with a family. 9 months after arriving in the U.S., she was reunited with her parents. I remember those weren't the happiest days of my life. It was hard to adjust to living in the orphanage, living with girls who had never had families. And in the house with the family, I didn't feel like I really fit in either, she says. I know other Peter Pans had happy experiences, and others had worse ones than mine. I don't complain, but that was my experience, she adds. Lorenz had to wait 5 years to see his parents again, and the reunion came with its own challenges. So much time had passed that they still looked at me as the little boy they left behind. But I had already gone through a lot. I was already a full-fledged teenager, who had had to fend for himself for years, he says. I woke up from the adventure when I left Father Walsh's program and my parents arrived. That was in '63, says Armando Vizcaino, a 70-year-old certified public accountant, married with 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. Looking back, Vizcaino says he's amazed at how well most of the Peter Pans did, even though the risk was enormous. According to the Pedro Pan Group, by 1966, 90% of the children who were still in shelters had been reunited with their parents. There are doctors, lawyers, engineers, mayors. I would say most of them found a good path in this country, says 67-year-old Akazabal. We Peter Pans feel like brothers because that experience we went through unites us, and every time we get together, we talk about today's things, but we always go back to talking about what we went through. We are more than 14,000, and each one had a different experience, she adds. Testimony of Hilda Diaz, 68 years old. I was 8 years old when the political cancer arrived on our beautiful island. I had the misfortune of seeing how they entered Havana, destroying everything in their path. I saw how they took over my parents' businesses, how they came to our house and took my father and my 13-year-old brother at 3 a.m. One day, just like that, without warning or reason, they came to our house and took the 2 cars my parents owned. I saw how they took my cousin, who worked in one of my father's businesses, and sentenced him to 20 years in prison without having committed any crime. Simply because he said he did not sympathize with Fidel's socialist system, which up until that point claimed to be socialist. Even though we had the best lawyer of that time, nothing could be done. He was sentenced anyway, and that lawyer died of a heart attack from the fury he felt. I went with my mother to visit my cousin at La Cabana prison, where political prisoners were kept in a damp grotto. Since I was a child, the women who went to see their family members said that to receive the messages the prisoners sent us, it had to be through tiny slits near the ground in the grotto, and the smell was terrible. I still remember and have had many issues trying to erase those horrific memories. My cousin was cruelly tortured. They pulled out his fingernails and toenails, twisted his ankles, and left him permanently limping. They strapped him to a spinning bed with a drop of water falling on his forehead for 48 hours. They put him in a closet small enough only to sit in, where he had to do everything, including his necessities, for 4 days, just to see if he would talk, but he didn't know anything. But those damned torturers inflicted pain just for pleasure. I imagine that's how they taught a lesson to the discontented and dissidents. I know his case wasn't the only one. Those henchmen tortured and murdered many civilians and did much worse than Batista's military. They later transferred my cousin to the Isla de Pinos prison. I visited him there many times with my mother. It was horrible how we were treated. I lived on the island from when that cancer arrived in 1959 until we left Cuba for Spain in 1968, and then I arrived in the United States in 1972. My brother fled Cuba with a group of young men in a small boat in 1965 and arrived in Miami, where he was received by some friends of my parents, Polish nationals named Jose and Jacobo, who had owned clothing stores in Cuba. My brother was the one who petitioned for us to come from Spain. While at school, in pre-university, I saw how boys who didn't agree with what the teachers were indoctrinating were taken away, and they disappeared, with their families never knowing what happened to them. In short, my adolescence was filled with fear. We truly lived through moments of panic and uncertainty, thinking about our family, friends, and neighbors. We never knew who would be next. Sometimes, while waiting in line to see a movie at the cinema, the G2, state security, or police would arrive asking for ID cards, our form of identification in Cuba, for no reason at all, just to remind us that we were constantly being watched. They instilled fear so we'd accept everything they forced upon us. It was no longer out of conviction or sympathy, it was because of fear. But that fear turned into deeper hatred, and in my opinion, even hell is too mild for those wicked people. Boys were forced to join the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution or some communist organization, and if they didn't have a participation ID, they'd be taken away. The phone lines were tapped, and you couldn't speak against the regime because they were listening. There was no privacy. All Cuban property owners were stripped of everything, bank money, cars, everything. They looted us at will. Then they disarmed us, no one could own a firearm. I remember my father had 2 pistols, one at home and one at the bar where he spent most of his time. He had cafeterias on many Havana street corners. We weren't millionaires, but we lived well before Castro, and it wasn't stolen money or earned through trickery, but through hard work and saving. Cuba had everything before, it was beautiful. Considered by many foreigners to be like Paris, Milan, or New York. I had many friends whose parents died of heart attacks when everything was taken from them. I'm very proud of my father, who always remained calm. It's true that I never again saw him smile like he used to, before that cancer named Fidel and his revolution, which destroyed the island of Cuba. When they got to the U.S., they worked 3 jobs to get ahead, never asking for government help, because that would be lacking in pride and dignity. My parents were never stingy or arrogant, they never discriminated and always helped low-income families in Cuba. They bought toys for kids on 3 Kings' Day and birthdays. Always helping others. My father said the only people he discriminated against were the lazy. In short, when they arrived, the joy and dreams ended, along with liberty. My cousin served all 20 years of his sentence and was finally able to live some years in freedom in the USA. He passed away in 2015. He lived in Hialeah, a city in South Florida. His name was Jesus Muñoz. My brother lives in Miami Beach and his name is Pedro Diaz. My father's name was Santiago Miguel Diaz. Everything I've said is true, and I give full names so anyone who wants to verify it can do so. And anyone reading this story should think carefully if they still have doubts about what that so-called socialist revolution really was. We are among the Cubans who suffered greatly and were stripped of everything. We were not allowed to take anything out of Cuba. They took all our jewelry. At the airport, a militia woman ripped off my mother's engagement ring, and they took from me the earrings my grandmother had given me for my 15th birthday and a comb made of mother-of-pearl with gold decorations. It wasn't the material value but the sentimental value that mattered to us. My father also had his engagement ring taken from him before leaving the island, and I lost a ring my grandfather had given me as a gift. In short, everyone who was leaving Cuba for Spain had everything taken away from them. It was basically a robbery, taking advantage of the power they had, acting like they were the owners of the island and of all Cubans and their belongings. You were only allowed to take the clothes you were wearing and one change of clothes. I've held on to resentment all these years because it was a traumatic experience for me, something I've never been able to overcome. And the humiliations when we submitted the request to leave Cuba, that's when they sent my father to forced labor on a farm, my mother to another, and me to a different one. We were all separated. They always claimed that students going to the countryside for schoolwork were volunteers, but that's a lie. It was mandatory, just like attending Fidel's speeches at the Central Plaza, renamed after 1959 as the Plaza de la Revolution. It was the strategic place Fidel chose to give his speeches and show the world an image of mass acceptance by Cubans, because that plaza could hold a huge number of people. They even managed to gather more than 1 million people to go listen to Fidel, rounding them up from schools and workplaces in trucks to take them there by force. Nothing in Cuba is voluntary. I don't know how things are now that Fidel is no longer around, but it was always like that. Since we left Cuba, we've never returned, and I don't plan to return until the communist dictatorship no longer exists on the island and the Castros and all their henchmen are no longer there. Testimony of Isabel Marin, 66 years old. In the first 2 years of the revolution, as a child, I didn't notice the changes because I still had access to candy and toys, and I was still enrolled in the same private school, Academia de Mendez, and visited the same library with its wonderful collection of beautiful and enjoyable books. I was never a pionera, revolutionary student, probably because I went to church, but no one talked about it. I remember the sound of militiamen marching through the streets and shouting slogans. In 3rd grade, I started at a school that had previously been run by nuns but had been nationalized. Then came the first property seizures, and with them the emigration of those affected. 2 of my aunts and their families emigrated. Before they left, the government made an inventory of all their belongings, and if anything was broken, they had to keep the remains in a bag and show them upon departure. In Havana, an aunt who was a nurse and lived with the one who emigrated came back from the airport to find the apartment sealed. She had to pay the price they set to get back her right to live there, and also had to pay for her own furniture. My mother had a hair salon in our home's living room, and during the second seizure, they took everything. We were left with an empty room and not even a chair to sit on. The furniture was piled up in a warehouse, even though no one needed it. I also remember that as a child, I used to accompany my mother to the cemetery every Sunday. While she cleaned the family tomb and placed flowers, I would wander around visiting graves, especially those with photos and epitaphs that caught my attention. One day, without realizing it, I wandered off and ended up at a ditch where they threw the corpses of the rebels, still in bloodied clothes. I think I screamed from fright, and my mother practically dragged me away from that place. From that day on, my aunts convinced us to go to Sunday school at the Methodist Church instead of to the cemetery. I left Cuba in 2017 heading to the United States, just before turning 64, after being petitioned by my daughter, who had permanent residency. I always wanted to be the one to initiate the departure, but it wasn't possible. From 1994 to 2003 in Cuba, I worked for the independent news agency Cuba Press. My daughter left for Spain in 2008 on a scholarship, and after finishing her studies, of course, she never returned. The 1970s. With the arrival of the 1970s and my young age of 2 at the start of 1970, I can't remember anything because I wasn't even conscious or mature enough to understand. But during the 70s I do remember having a difficult childhood, between power outages, religious persecution, and the targeting of anyone who spoke out against the government, in Stalinist fashion. It was definitely a difficult time of adaptation, but the people had to understand that the Cuban Revolution was building socialism, and we were in a moral and psychological war against the empire. At least, that's what they made us believe, and everyone believed it. In fact, Cubans have lived for 60 years thinking that the Yankee Empire wants to invade us and that we must be prepared. Pure fear-driven propaganda and manipulation to blame others for our republic's misfortunes and the inefficiency of the socialist system implemented by the Castros and their little group of rebels, olive green dinosaurs, as I call them. As a child, adapting to the world under the protection and care of my parents, I was only interested in playing, especially with my cousins, since my mother's family was quite large. She was the youngest of 11 siblings. I had second cousins my age and even older. With 10 uncles and aunts, imagine how many cousins I had. But I did hear everyone complaining and giving their opinions, and I saw my dear mother struggling to support us, since my parents were already separated when I was born. Although people were still somewhat excited about the revolution, they were also cautious or skeptical about socialism or communism. Only the intellectuals of that time really knew what communism was, and it wasn't what the government portrayed or taught. This was also a time of great repression, persecution, imprisonment, disappearances, shortages, adaptation, resignation, and discontent, but without hope. There were complaints on one side, and on the other side were the revolutionary Castro supporters with their gag law, pointing fingers at anyone who complained so they could be punished in any way, not just political dissidents but also all religious people. At that time, religion was seen as counter-revolutionary, and as the commander used to say, He who is not with the revolution is against the revolution, which, by the way, is a plagiarism of a biblical verse from Jesus. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. Luke 11 verse 23. Moreover, Christianity and other existing religions didn't fit with the Marxist doctrine of scientific communism that the government had adopted and taught in schools. In this way, all kinds of competition, opponents, critics, and foreign worshippers were eliminated. They began to worship the personality of Fidel Castro, and people hung portraits of Fidel or Che in their homes, even to this day, whether out of devotion, habit, or hypocrisy, to make everyone think it was a revolutionary household. That's why I believe God has allowed so much suffering for so long, because they abandoned the true God to worship men or other gods, Catholic or Afro-Cuban saints. Socialism always needs an ideological messiah, it's part of their strategy and their game, and Fidel became that messiah for Cubans. I even heard older people say that Fidel was the second Jesus Christ, or Jesus Christ reincarnated. Just imagine how deep the ignorance and fanaticism ran among the Cuban people, and unfortunately, that was the majority opinion. I clearly remember in my childhood how we had to wait in long lines, sometimes for a week, outside the store to buy toys or shoes once a year. Whether we had money or not, it didn't matter, the regime handed out toys once a year. Some families were lucky enough to be in the first group when stores opened, since families were divided into sections or groups. I don't know if it was by lottery or something else, but if you were in the last group, you only got bad toys, Chinese junk. No scooters, strollers, bikes, tricycles, roller skates, battery-powered cars, or electronic toys. I never had a bicycle as a child. I still have a photo of myself at age 4 on someone else's bike, with a big smile, but it was just for the photo. It was depressing that in a so-called socialist superpower, or rising power, children couldn't have toys whenever they wanted or whenever their parents wanted to buy them. But it wasn't the same for families of Communist Party officials. It was the same story with shoes. Although there were shoe stores and cobblers in Cuba, people always wanted good sneakers, even if they were Russian-made. To get them, you had to survive those endless lines, with all the problems, fights, sleepless nights, stress, and desperation, just to get your size before they sold out. And that's what socialism is, shared misery and collective mediocrity. Without a doubt, the 70s and 90s were the bitterest eras for me. Although in the 70s hunger was less intense than in the 90s, all families depended on the ration book, or more accurately, the rationing book, because that poor-quality little notebook recorded monthly food and personal hygiene products. The grocer, the manager or clerk of the store or market, would write in that book what each family bought that month. Everything was rationed. If there were 4 members in a household, they were allotted per month, 2 tubes of toothpaste, 5 pounds of rice per person, a set number of eggs, beef or chicken, which was very scarce, root vegetables, produce, fruits, rice, oil, cigarettes, crackers, bread, etc. Things that would last about a week, because they were all limited. I said earlier that hunger in socialism is a strategy. My mother would give up her cigarette rations, since she smoked, in exchange for cans of cookies, condensed milk, salt, sugar, oil, soap, or whatever else we ran out of, things that filled your stomach, even if they didn't nourish you. What can I say about toothpaste and toilet paper? In this decade, all Cubans learned to wipe with a newspaper. By the 90s, even newspapers were scarce, and you had to wait in long lines to buy a 2-page paper, not exactly for reading. The soap was horrible, a third world, Castro-style product. Although some products were sometimes available on the open market. Since the 1960s, workers and students began to be tied to the revolutionary process, and those who stood out in their jobs or schools were recruited for the Communist Party, PCC, or the Union of Young Communists, UJC. Those who refused had to work twice as hard as the committed communists to earn household appliances, bonuses, scholarships, or a house or apartment. They even had to volunteer for hours in construction or agriculture to be eligible for housing, an apartment, or a scholarship. Many positions, roles, or responsibilities require being a member of the Communist Party. This meant that the person had to report, denounce, or condemn anyone who opposed or disagreed with the revolutionary process, even if it was a family member. This brought great division within families, inside their own households, and in society itself. These people were known as chivatos or chivatones, a term used since the 1950s for those who collaborated with the dictatorship. Also, starting in the 1960s and more so in the 1970s, anything of capitalist influence was banned: singers, musical groups, artists, writers, magazines, etc. This was labeled as enemy propaganda and ideological diversion, even if it was just art and had nothing to do with politics. This absurd policy lasted until the 1980s. And what can be said about Cuban exiled artists who sang or spoke against the dictatorship? If anyone was caught listening to them, they were in serious trouble, possibly even prison. I managed to listen to the Beatles and other rock bands, as well as Spanish singers like Roberto Carlos, Julio Iglesias, Camilo Sesto, Rafael, Nino Bravo, among many others, in the 1980s. Before that, they weren't even allowed on the radio. A unique and closed-off extremism imposed through fear of keeping an island isolated from the outside world, with over 10 million slaves and subjects. During this decade, we began to rely more on the Soviet Union, which provided not only oil but everything else: clothing, personal use items, work supplies, school supplies, healthcare products, equipment, technology, and even food products, whether processed or agricultural. The influence of Russian culture and customs, which were completely different and foreign to ours, was so strong that the TV programs, like soap operas, movies, cartoons, and even the language, became a daily norm. I remember that when I started secondary school, Russian was already imposed as a subject, and we were expected to learn it. Even though I've always loved languages, I never liked being forced. Russian is a language used only in Russia, perhaps useful back then in Eastern Europe because the USSR was a communist empire, but not in a Caribbean island thousands of kilometers away. In the Cuban education system and any Latin American country, English has always been taught as the universal language. Maybe it was because of being bombarded so heavily with Russian culture that we began to reject it or develop resentment toward it. Though I'm over that now, I don't despise anyone or reject any culture. On the contrary, I love learning and discovering, and I've had the opportunity to visit 8 countries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, and even live in some of them. In short, we practically became a Russian colony or neo-colony. What can I say about transportation? Even worse. Long lines, hours of waiting, especially on weekends when going to the beach during summer vacation. After 2 to 4 hours of waiting to catch a bus, what we call a guagua, we would arrive exhausted, hungry, and thirsty. But for me, going to the beach was a huge joy. As a child, I had to resign myself to that reality and always assumed that's how it was everywhere in the world. We were always made to believe that Cuba was the best country in Latin America and that, compared to Africa and Asia, we were much better off. And in part, that was true, but only until 1959, when its misfortune, captivity, and the socialist pharaonic empire of the Castros began. In the 70s, there were only 2 TV channels, 6 hours a day during the week and 8 hours on weekends. Both were, of course, state-owned, because in Cuba, everything is under the state's power, control, and distribution. Both channels presented manipulated and false information, one slightly more cultural than the other, but the content was so bad and depressing that people only watched the Saturday night movies. Even then, most were Russian, including the soap operas and cartoons. In movie theaters, there was a bit more variety. Cuba was a cultural powerhouse before 1959, and its film industry was very productive and of high quality. That tradition continued through the 1990s, although with a different format, especially with documentaries and movies that had to be more revolutionary, ideologically speaking. So many more things, transformations, deformations, customs, and prohibitions, were imposed on us. We were completely isolated from the world, and those still there remain isolated, even though there are some freedoms now. That's only because the government has had to be flexible about certain things, especially since we're now in the third decade of the 21st century. But Cuba is an island frozen in time, aging and deteriorating more each day. For me, traveling to Cuba feels like traveling back in time, and I'm not talking about visiting a primitive island with ancient traditions by choice, but going backward into a destroyed country, ruined by time, mismanagement, and the misery communism brings. By that time, home telephones practically didn't exist, because one of the regime's strategies was to keep us uninformed. My grandmother ordered a phone in 1959, already under Castro's rule, and it wasn't installed until 1989. The decade of the 70s explained. The beginning of this decade witnessed a Cuba with a consolidated political regime, strengthened by the enormous support it received from the USSR. By the late 1960s, Cuba was receiving half of all the aid the USSR allocated to underdeveloped countries. The Soviets bought Cuban sugar at prices higher than the market rate and sent oil at prices far below those set by OPEC. Thanks to Soviet aid, Cuba became one of the most powerful military forces in Latin America, surpassing even Brazil and Mexico. During this decade, Fidel led a series of movements in defense of the non-aligned countries, becoming a true leader in defending the weakest. He participated in conferences and congresses and traveled through Latin America, China, Vietnam, and Africa. The Soviet leader of the time, Leonid Brezhnev, enjoyed a close friendship with Fidel, and together they predicted, in 1974 during Brezhnev's visit to Havana, the triumph of communism in the near future. To cap off this golden age of international relations, in 1975 the Organization of American States, OAS, repealed the sanctions it had imposed on Cuba during the previous decade, primarily due to Cuba's support for revolutionary movements in the region. Soon after, numerous Latin American countries re-established diplomatic relations with the Cuban government. Infectious diseases were eradicated, infant mortality was drastically reduced, and demographic growth was brought under control. The number of doctors quadrupled in proportion to the population, and healthcare reached everyone at no cost. Transportation infrastructure was improved, affordable housing construction programs were successfully implemented, and illiteracy was eradicated, even in rural areas, where, during Batista's time, the illiteracy rate averaged 41.7%. In the political realm, although this period saw the clearest assimilation of the Soviet model, Fidel maintained his independence, considering Cuba more a member of the non-aligned countries than a part of the socialist bloc. During this era, the last great epochs of internationalism took place, such as the deployment of 200,000 Cuban troops to Angola, 1975, who came to support the Marxist SWAPO government during a critical period, as South Africa attempted to overthrow the regime by backing the UNITA rebels led by Jonas Savimbi. 3 years later, in 1978, Cuba sent troops to Ethiopia. Castro forged close ties with emerging leftist leaders in Latin America and celebrated the Sandinista Revolution. In 1976, a new constitution was proclaimed, once again reaffirming Fidel Castro as the undisputed head of state. This new constitution expanded Cuba's 7 provinces to the 15 that exist today. Also in that year, the Asambleas del Poder Popular, People's Power Assemblies, were created, governmental bodies whose members are democratically elected by the Cuban people and are entrusted with significant administrative responsibilities within the state. The 1980s. This era began in the year 1980 with the first mass exodus provoked by the Cuban regime, to relieve internal pressure and discontent on the island. Thousands of Cubans were able to legally leave the country on boats owned either within or outside the island, especially from Miami in South Florida, where most Cuban exiles lived, many of them banished, former political prisoners, or relatives who had managed to escape the island at the start of the revolution. These people were never allowed to see their families in Cuba again, as they were prohibited from re-entering the country. That's why the Cuban government strategically prepared and organized the mass exodus from the port of Mariel in the province of Havana, following the event at the Peruvian embassy where many Cubans had sought refuge that year. This wasn't the only exodus, others followed in 1994 and again starting in 2004, also allowed by the government to release internal pressure, not only by sea but also by air, through third countries such as Ecuador and Nicaragua. Although many Cubans managed to flee clandestinely by sea and air, since Cuba is an island and has no land borders, until the mid-1980s, it was illegal and punishable by prison for anyone trying to escape the country clandestinely. Later, the penalty was reduced to fines, and today, 2019, the chances are much lower because the U.S. government eliminated the Cuban Adjustment Act, which had benefited Cubans fleeing the island by any means who managed to enter the United States. Thousands, or hundreds of thousands, of Cubans have lost their lives crossing the Florida Straits or trying to reach the U.S.-Mexico border over these long 60 years. Logically, socialism has never worked, does not work, and will never work in Cuba or any country in the world. It didn't work in a superpower and the largest country in the world, the Soviet Union, and therefore it won't work anywhere, regardless of the variant or doctrine. If more than 1 million Cubans have fled the island by sea or across borders in these 60 years, willing to risk their lives, preferring death over living in captivity, misery, and oppression, and rather than fight for a lost cause within Cuba, how can anyone believe that Cuba is a model for anything? What achievements can it claim? What kind of power can it be if it can't even retain the relatives of its own leaders, many of whom have also opted for exile, fleeing the country? Destroyed cities, malnourished populations, shortages, persecution, repression of dissent, unsanitary conditions and plagues, citizens dying from treatable diseases, and much more. The poor in the U.S. live like millionaires compared to Cubans. The accomplishments the government has achieved, thanks to aid from Russia, China, and especially Venezuela, are the same that any third-world country could attain if given intensive foreign aid or support. Just look at Angola and Chile, for example. Angola, after its socialist revolution, fueled by Castro's efforts to spread socialism across all continents, is now one of the most prosperous countries in Africa, because they resisted and overthrew communism. On the other hand, Chile, after the defeat of the communist president Salvador Allende in a coup, in which he lost his life, is now one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America, surpassing Argentina with its political decline and leftist governments, and even Brazil, which is still struggling to recover, followed by Uruguay and Peru, which have resisted communism and strengthened their democracy and justice systems. Meanwhile, Cuba, once known as the Pearl of the Antilles, with a prosperous economy and impeccable culture despite poor past governments, is now the misery and scum of the continent. Many even despise Cubans simply because of the damn communism that the regime has tried to impose on other Latin American countries. What can we say about Venezuela, which once had the strongest economy on the continent, rich in natural resources, and was the top crude oil exporter? Today, it is the most suffering country in the region, gripped by hunger, repression, crime, and looting. Two opposing examples: some countries chose a failed policy and are now paying the price, while others decided not to allow dictatorship or communism in their lands. And although former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet and former Peruvian President Ollanta Humala were left-wing, they couldn't change the constitution to consolidate power and advance socialism in the region, because the people didn't allow it. We hope that Chile and Peru continue to grow, that Brazil and Colombia rise again, and that the remaining far-left regimes on the continent will one day free themselves from their chains. Following this preamble and continuing with my personal experience in the years I lived in my native Cuba, in my opinion, the 1980s was the best period of that so-called socialist revolution, because Cubans experienced more abundance. We depended even more on the Russians, and partly because the government had managed to get rid of many of the dissenters and discontented people after the mass Mariel exodus. That period further strengthened the Cuban regime. Cubans could buy more things freely. Even though we still had miserable transportation, basic needs, and only the same 2 television channels with the same format and the same lies, tales, and supposed revolutionary achievements, an entire propaganda campaign to make us believe we were doing well, you had to work hard or be a loyal informer to earn household appliances like radios, black and white TVs, washing machines, Russian fans, and all that cheap Russian and Chinese stuff they offered us. Culturally, they started becoming more flexible regarding foreign influence, especially English or American culture. However, they still banned the music of Cuban exiled artists like Celia Cruz, Gloria Estefan, Willie Chirino, and others. The hippie fashion, rock and roll, and heavy metal movements were on the rise, although hippies and freaks, rockers, were frowned upon and rejected, as were homosexuals and lesbians. That new man had to be a macho, but a revolutionary one. In that decade, there were no power blackouts. We had more entertainment, and for the first time, the regime allowed private businesses, artisan fairs, and street vendors. Although possession of American dollars was still illegal and punishable, selling Cuban art to foreigners was forbidden, and the buying, selling, or trading of property like houses, apartments, commercial spaces, cars, etc., remained illegal. Religious persecution continued, and there was still repression against those who protested or reported human rights violations to international organizations. However, the number of dissidents and political opponents kept growing. That golden era didn't last long, because starting in 1986, changes and adjustments began due to the perestroika, restructuring, initiated by then-Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. This policy was implemented in 1985 and marked the beginning of a radical shift in the socialist model that had been in place in the USSR until then. Gorbachev's vision for the future was essentially to reorganize socialism to preserve it. One of his goals was to transform Soviet society to be ready to contribute to the creation of a new economic system within socialism. This process led to many political conversions toward democracy, including within Kremlin members, bringing a wave of consequences to the economy and society that culminated in the end of the Gorbachev era and the ultimate dissolution of the USSR. By 1988, the Cuban regime was preparing to stop relying entirely on the Soviet Union and began gradually tightening its grip. By 1991, with the fall of communism in the USSR, things started getting much harder. Even though Cuba still had bilateral agreements with the Soviet Union, it began preparing for a state of emergency and the start of a new economic crisis, unlike anything seen before, a crisis that the government dubbed the Special Period. Nevertheless, the Castro regime continued with its expansionist ideas and kept sending troops to Angola, along with logistical training and funding of subversive groups in other African, Latin American, and Asian countries. I was drafted into mandatory military service in 1986, and in 1988, I was nearly sent to Angola in the final deployment of that war. But I was spared because I had fallen ill and was in poor health at the time, to the point where I was discharged from the army for medical reasons. Some of my colleagues died in that war, others returned sick. They were just 18-year-old kids fighting a war that wasn't theirs, in a foreign country that hadn't given them anything, where they didn't even speak the same language. More than 500 young Cubans lost their lives in those so-called internationalist missions. But that's how communism is, just like fascism, which also came from the left. It's an expansionist and imperialist ideology, but from the left. The USSR used its allies like Cuba and sent them on these missions to seize control of territories and continue building a communist empire across the 5 continents. The USSR was a superpower, rich in resources, technology, and weaponry, more than capable of defending its territory, sustaining its entire population without relying on foreign markets or the stock exchange, and supporting and protecting its allies. But Gorbachev, perhaps without realizing or anticipating it, brought down not only the Soviet Empire but also the Eastern European Communist bloc. After every young Cuban completes their mandatory military service, they must be registered in the military reserve and continue training with the so-called MTT, in English, means Territorial Troop Militias, to remain active and ready for a war against the Empire of the North. An imaginary war that was never going to happen was simply the excuse to keep the population in fear, filled with hatred toward the enemy from the north, so that we would stay alert. But in reality, it was more about keeping us controlled and indoctrinated. The United States has never been a threat, because they have no interest in Cuba, and the only sanctions it's imposed on the Castro regime are economic ones. In the MTT, every 6 months, we received training and went to shooting ranges, political and military classes. I believe it is precisely because of all these things we Cubans have suffered that we so deeply despise impositions and any form of socialism, although many suffer from Stockholm Syndrome and continue to live in fear, even after leaving Cuba. They're afraid to speak, express themselves, or give their opinions, fearing they won't be allowed back into Cuba to visit. Others are nostalgic about communism, and when they face the reality of life, of having to work, fight, and strive to get ahead, they simply complain about the country that took them in and praise the country they fled from. As if it were more convenient for them to live in Cuba than outside of it. The decline of the Cuban economy. At the beginning of the 1980s, Cuba began to show signs of economic deterioration, as the standard of living started to decline. The healthcare system, education, and social services gradually lost some of the efficiency they had enjoyed in the previous decade. One of the key factors that caused this situation was poor management and administration. On one hand, key economic and industrial positions were assigned to political figures, members of the Communist Party, many of whom lacked the proper training to manage them. On the other hand, the implementation of the Soviet economic model proved unsuitable for Cuban society, which had nothing in common with the Slavic nations that formed part of the Soviet sphere. The attempt to reduce the plantation system and replace it with a more diversified economic base failed to achieve the expected success. Additionally, no efforts were made to promote tourism, despite it being the country's greatest potential asset at the time. In 1980, protests broke out among the population, prompting the government to allow anyone who wished to leave the country to do so. This led to the emigration of 125,000 Cubans through the port of Mariel, creating a real problem for the United States, which, faced with the massive influx, was forced to implement stricter immigration controls. At the same time, Cuba began to face growing international criticism for its alleged human rights violations against prisoners. Anti-Castro propaganda and pressure from the United States led Amnesty International to release negative reports on this issue. Cuba's image suffered a major blow in 1987 when General Arnaldo Ochoa and a group of officers were tried for corruption and drug trafficking. General Ochoa had received numerous honors for his participation in the Angola campaigns and was highly respected in the country. The trial was televised on Cuban national television, and the general admitted to the charges. He was eventually executed along with Colonel Antonio de la Guardia and Captains Amado Padrón and Jorge Martínez. The accused had embezzled millions of dollars by allowing Colombian traffickers to use Cuba as a transit point in their operations. The 1990s. This era, for me, was the worst I ever lived through in Cuba under the communist regime of the Castros. Although I only lived through the first 5 years of this decade, they were the 5 worst years of my life, years that will never be erased from my memory. Thank God I was able to escape that condition, and before starting my own family, I left Cuba for the United States at the end of 1995. Since arriving in this blessed, capitalist, first world country, the world's leading superpower, I've been able to visit 8 countries, 3 of which I've lived in, after becoming a U.S. citizen. I've earned like a poor man but lived like a rich one. I've not only been able to discover the world, learn about other cultures, and reach goals that would have been impossible had I remained in Cuba, but I've also learned a lot and had everything I've wanted, materially, socially, and spiritually. I've also had hard times and faced financial crises, but the best part is having the freedom to overcome them, to move forward without anyone controlling me. It's one thing for any country in the world, especially developing or poor countries, to go through an economic crisis. It's another thing entirely for that crisis to drag on and worsen over time. The reason is simple: when something doesn't work, it will never work, no matter how many times it's attempted. Cancer cannot be cured unless the tumor, organ, or affected area is removed. And as Albert Einstein said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Gorbachev understood this, as did those who supported the restructuring of the socialist model to escape the crisis they were trapped in, one with no way out, despite the USSR being the largest country in the world, with enough resources to be self-sufficient and even surpass the U.S. Socialism is a failed system. It didn't work in a superpower, the world's largest nation, the Soviet Union, which tried it for 70 years without ever becoming a first world country. On the contrary, many died of starvation. So, how could it possibly work on an island of 10 million people with few resources like Cuba, especially under a Castro-style communist dictatorship? Socialism is a utopia. A utopia is something that sounds beautiful but is unlikely. Capitalism is real because it is the only functioning economic and social system based on individual freedom. Capitalism offers the three basic freedoms: freedom of expression, economic freedom, and spiritual freedom. While capitalism rewards effort, socialism rewards loyalty. In capitalism, the individual can hold the state accountable, backed by the Constitution. In socialism, the state controls the individual, whether they like it or not, and the Constitution is merely a historical document with no real value. Historically, capitalism was created to replace feudalism, a model of slavery, control, and abuse by the state. Socialism was created to reclaim that tyrannical model of slavery, power, and control, but dressed up in humanist ideas. As for fascism, it was a socialist idea fused with capitalism, based on a free market economy and private property, but always under the control of the state. In fact, theoretically, fascism was a better idea. The problem was that a psychopath named Hitler, financed and empowered by economic elites who dreamed of a global political, economic, and religious empire, created a new version of fascism, Nazi fascism, which was more aggressive, violent, and militarized, but far removed from the original idea of 19th-century European progressives. But as José Martí once said, to be cultured is to be free. The mind is cultivated by reading. But many prefer to live in ignorance and keep believing everything socialism promises, because it sounds nice and fair. Many people love lies, whether consciously or not, and want the state to manage their lives because they don't know how to manage them themselves. And the fundamental weapon socialism, or any leftist ideology, uses is the lie, through propaganda. That's how they deceive the uneducated and ignorant, who are the ones that put them in power, only to complain later, when they could have prevented it. And the worst part is that after realizing the lies and abuse of power by their socialist rulers, they have no choice but to emigrate to a capitalist country, because they don't even dare to fight for their independence. And to top it off, they go on to vote for another socialist-leaning politician in the country they fled to, jeopardizing capitalism and harming all of us who think for ourselves, the educated, the intellectuals, the dignified, the free thinkers, the brilliant and not so brilliant minds, the entrepreneurs, the prosperous, the spiritual, the free citizens who enjoy democracy, who know their constitution, respect it, and protect it, who live by law and order, and all who use reason. There are many skulls in the world, but few brains. If Castro or the Cuban revolutionaries had allied with the United States, or better yet, had annexed or united as another state with their capitalist neighbor, the island of Cuba would have continued to prosper like in past eras, when it was considered the pearl of the Antilles. A prosperous and developing country, surpassed only by the U.S. and Canada in the Americas. But today, without a doubt, it is the poorest country in Latin America, still in economic, moral, and cultural decline. Logically, what hasn't worked in 60 years will never work in a modern, civilized world, if the same model and government continue, without democracy, freedoms, and rights. Hawaii is an island in the Pacific Ocean, about 4,000 kilometers, 2,500 miles, from the coast of California in the U.S. At the end of the 19th century, it was annexed to the United States as the 51st state, with barely 1.5 million inhabitants. Although Hawaii doesn't produce much, today it is considered the best state in the nation, with the highest quality of life, greatest prosperity, and best safety. If we were ever to see Cuba united with the U.S., I assure you it would become even more prosperous than Hawaii. Cuba has 42,426 square miles compared to Hawaii's 10931, and 10 times the population, with many more natural resources. It would be a radical transformation that could happen in less than 10 years. Cuba would not lose its identity or sovereignty, because Hawaii hasn't lost its own. There, they maintain their language, customs, culture, and traditions. For many, it is considered a paradise. This would be like a little brother seeking the protection of a big brother, his neighbor. It's like a small company merging with a large corporation to operate better and provide better benefits to that small business and its employees. Everyone wins. Another example I could mention is the State of Israel, with fewer than 14 million people, surrounded by hostile countries that hate it and want to see it wiped off the map, out of envy and religious extremism. Israel is the most prosperous state in the Middle East. It is a free and sovereign nation that depends on the protection of its big brother, the United States, even though it is far from the American continent. Israel would not have survived without the support, unconditional aid, and cooperation of the U.S., which God has used and continues to use to care for his flock, his people. Because although God shows no favoritism, he keeps his promises, and because of the promise he made to Abraham, the father of the Jews and the father of the Christian faith, and because salvation comes from the Jews, because Jesus, the Son of God, God incarnate, the Word made flesh, came through them, God has protected Israel despite its enemies who have tried to wipe it out and erase it. The devil, our common enemy, has always tried to destroy the Creator's plans and order. If one day Cuba were to achieve a democratic, multi-party transition, and a political party with annexationist or unionist ideas were to win the elections and make a proposal to a conservative right-wing party in the United States existing at that time, I believe we could at least achieve for Cuba what Puerto Rico has, becoming an associated state, in case the United States were not interested in acquiring it as another state of the Union. Although many believe that no party in the U.S. would be interested in Cuba, the truth is that it's not convenient for the United States to have a communist dictatorship so close, in the Caribbean, knowing that while it may not be a direct threat at this moment, it is a danger to the political and economic stability of the continent, at least for right-wing conservatives like the Republican Party. The U.S. would try to prevent another dictatorship from forming in Cuba after a peaceful and democratic transition to freedom, knowing that Iran, Russia, and China have vested interests in the region, due to its proximity to the U.S., and because it is a prosperous transit zone with a unique climate. These three nations are nuclear powers, not just U.S. competitors, but treacherous enemies who, although they do not declare war on the United States, do seek to undermine it and secretly conspire against it. So, for sure, the U.S. would consider and support such an effort, because they would not want to repeat the history of the October missile crisis, which marked the beginning of the Cold War, when we came close to a third world nuclear war. But making this happen is very difficult, not because the U.S. wouldn't want it, but because the Cuban people don't want it, even though many wish it were so. The Cubans on the island and many of those outside are happy slaves or satisfied captives. They believe that all they need is clothing, trinkets, the right to open a small business, the ability to travel so they can show off, boast, and act like they're something special. Cubans have lost the sense of freedom and have no idea what dignity really is. They think everything is about dressing well, partying, showing off, drinking, and eating well. Patriotic Cubans are becoming extinct, and those who dare to fight for Cuba's freedom, inside or outside the island, by peacefully denouncing the regime's abuses and demanding their rights, are to be admired, but unfortunately, they are the minority. After more than 30 years of socialist revolution in Cuba, I can say it was the era of massive blackouts and long hours. Electricity wasn't cut off like in the 80s, instead, electricity was turned on, but only for 4 hours a day, mostly during the early morning, as if to prevent the scarce food in the fridge from spoiling completely. But refrigerators would break down, we'd go to bed without electricity, and spend the night sweating in our rooms on a tropical island where the summer heat is unbearable. They would turn the power back on around 4 a.m., so we'd wake up with light and get ready for work or school. What cunning! Or rather, what malice from the tyranny! Only on weekends did they allow the electricity to stay on a bit longer. Many companies and workplaces had to function without electricity because the government could no longer control the situation. Only hospitals, hotels, tourist areas, foreign companies, ministries, and the mansions of government officials were spared from the blackouts. What else can I say? Famine struck us. In fact, Cuba has always suffered from malnutrition due to scarcity, but in that decade, we truly experienced hunger. I remember going 3 straight months eating nothing but white rice, beans, and beets. For breakfast, orange juice and the single small bread roll we were entitled to per person per day, a tiny ball of flour that, when squeezed in your hand, turned into a ping-pong ball. You had to choose whether to eat it in the morning or the afternoon because it was only one per person per day. Fruit was nearly non-existent, with just some bananas and oranges. The potatoes were gone. Rice was scarce. If we ate lunch, we didn't eat dinner. Meat disappeared entirely, not even pork, which was the most consumed meat, could be found. If anyone bought meat, it was done illegally and at astronomical prices. A month's salary would barely cover 3 meals with meat. Eggs reached a price of 10 pesos each, with the average monthly salary being 120 pesos. Imagine, someone earning that salary could only afford 12 eggs per month. But in reality, after buying rice and other basic goods, plus paying for public services like electricity and water, the ration only allowed 3 meals a month. If you managed to earn something in the streets, you might be able to eat for a week. Still, people found ways to survive, but I witnessed an elderly neighbor die from the flu because he was severely malnourished. Transportation was worse than ever, it wasn't worth going out. People who worked far away had to leave at dawn without light and return at night without light, usually getting home after 8 p.m. Because of this, the government distributed bicycles to ease the transportation problem, but you had to earn it the hard way, by proving to be a good worker, efficient, a committed communist, a leader, or an informant. Riding a bike at night was dangerous because there were gangs of bicycle thieves who would kill just for a bike. The heavy, ugly Chinese bikes ended up costing 1,000 Cuban pesos, equivalent to $400. Riding a bike in a dark city without electricity was more dangerous than being in a war zone under crossfire. I knew a neighbor who was a company official. Although he had a car, he couldn't use it because there was no gasoline, so he was forced to ride a bicycle. He was attacked and seriously injured by his bike. He ended up mentally impaired. I believe he suffered a brain injury from the blow to his head. People weren't just killed for bicycles, they were also killed for jewelry. If someone went out showing off or, as was common in Cuba, wore little chains around their neck, they could be killed for that too. Even for a pair of brand-name shoes. It didn't matter if you were an elderly person or a teenager, they'd kill you just the same. Those who survived those robberies were considered miracles. That was yet another achievement of the oppressive Castro regime, which didn't even provide citizens with basic protection. Yet it was quick to respond to any protest, potential uprising, theft, or attack on state property. By 1992, there was a slight opening. They began to relax or allow things that had previously been harshly punished or savagely forbidden. This was due to international pressure and the influence of Pope John Paul II, who was the first pope to visit Cuba after 1959, some 30 years into the tyranny. John Paul II visited Cuba in January 1998. But in Cuba, laws are unstable and are applied or removed depending on what benefits the dictatorship. Just as they imprisoned people for possessing dollars until the 1980s, they later allowed it because family remittances became a major source of foreign currency. Before this decade, it was legal to eat beef and even lobster, but starting in the 1990s with the arrival of the special period, it became illegal to buy or sell these items, even to fish them. On top of a crisis triggered by the end of absolute dependence on the Russians, which the Castro regime had enjoyed, they made us even hungrier by imposing laws and sanctions to prevent meat from being diverted away from international tourism and Communist Party leaders. The same thing happened with the agricultural market, or what was known as the free farmers market. At times, it was allowed, and at other times, it was banned. The government couldn't supply the whole population, and seeing that it was cheaper to let the people supply themselves through those who had a small plot of land for farming or raising animals, even though it went against socialist principles, since in a socialist society nothing free or market-based is allowed or accepted, they allowed it temporarily. But when they saw those farmers, growers, ranchers, or their distributors were making money and buying cars and houses, they once again banned the free farmers market. This has been going on for over 60 years. As I explained earlier, hunger is a communist strategy. During this decade of an unprecedented crisis, and with the legalization of the dollar, the government took advantage of the situation to collect all the gold citizens had in their possession, offering to buy it at ridiculous prices. Out of sheer need and hunger, people were forced to sell their gold to the state in order to make a little extra money to buy food. That's why I believe that in this world, especially coming from the left, economic crises are invented or deliberately created to take advantage. I had to sell my bicycle, which I had earned at work as an inspector for the electric company, since my job was out on the street, inspecting both residential and commercial areas. By 1993, I had no other option but to sell my means of transportation for 1,000 Cuban pesos in order to buy food, not even in my city, or in the capital. I had to travel to the countryside, deep into the interior of the country, on trucks, to buy directly from the peasants a half sack of rice, some potatoes, and a chicken, and that was where the 1,000 pesos basically went. The supermarkets were empty and full of flies. Cafeterias were open but had no products, nothing to offer. In the 1980s, we could eat croquettes, sandwiches, and bread with tortilla or fried eggs. These cafeterias were called hunger killers, but by this decade, they were just historical memories. The pizzerias were closed, though not the private homes or paladas, which were allowed starting in 1994. Some people sold prepared food on the street, but from questionable sources. There were cases of pizzas made with condoms, dog and cat meat served instead of ham or other meats, and even human meat stolen from hospitals. The only thing I sometimes dared to eat, if anything, was a tamale, which was made only with corn, and corn was not yet too scarce. Between hunger, poverty, blackouts, and hopelessness, I fell ill with nervous problems and suffered a deep depression that required hospitalization. I had lost over 50 pounds in less than 3 months. Admitted to the hospital, I saw people with curable diseases like tuberculosis or pneumonia die. Meanwhile, the whole world believes that healthcare in Cuba is wonderful. Even today, people still die of treatable illnesses, and I can testify to that, because I knew neighbors in the 5 different neighborhoods I used to live in Havana, who died of dengue, pneumonia, encephalitis, stroke, etc. However, this decade was also one of spiritual awakening in Cuba, partly because of the need, and partly because it was God's timing. The truth is, many times God must break us so that we seek Him, so that we acknowledge Him as the only God and rely on His promises. By 1993, I left my state job, since all jobs are state-controlled, and began trading more in the streets. I became a fan of shortwave radio and listened to programs from the U.S., such as Family Radio, Christian Science, Radio Marti, the BBC of London, etc. The gospel reached me through radio signals. I remember saying the prayer of faith and confession, accepting Christ as my Savior, with no intermediaries or witnesses, just me alone in my room, listening to a battery-powered radio during the blackout for hours. Later, I decided to approach a church as the radio programs advised. I always thought churches had to be buildings, so I went all the way to Regla, the town where I was born and raised, from Alomar, because Alomar was a city built after 1959, and there were no church buildings of any kind, not even Catholic, since in socialism there is no room for God. It is an atheist doctrine that neither believes in nor accepts God or any form of divinity. However, there were churches, but in apartments. Alomar is a city of buildings 5 to 6 stories tall, with 4 12-story buildings and 1 18-story building. So, everything there was apartments. Believers began to gather in apartments offered by their owners to hold services, and thus, the gospel began to grow in Havana and later expanded throughout the island through missions from these house churches or house gatherings. As I mentioned earlier, once international opinion and the Vatican began putting pressure on the Cuban government, and seeing that those seeking God felt at peace, easing tensions among the population, the regime started to be more flexible and even allowed members of the Communist Party to attend church. That was a miracle, and God allowed it because He had to break the Cuban people hard through an unprecedented crisis when we stopped depending on the Soviet Empire. People began seeking God and tearing down their idols, converting from idolatry to the living God, creator of the universe. Even so, the government did not allow the construction of new churches because that went against Marxist doctrine. It closely monitored these private congregations, cells, or house churches, infiltrating government informants to find out what they did, what they taught, and how much money was collected in these religious or worship services. And so, that revival has continued growing for more than 25 years. No one can stop it, because when God intervenes and deals with people, no fear or obstacle can prevent worship. Communist countries in Europe have fallen, but other countries in Latin America and Asia have turned toward socialism, which now seems to be fashionable. Meanwhile, Islam has conquered territories and imposed itself through terror, expanding and overrunning countries, massacring and dominating everywhere it goes. Still, Christianity continues to grow across all 5 continents, and despite repression, religious persecution, or danger, Christians prefer to die as martyrs rather than be subjected to or enslaved by political or religious doctrines. Such is the case in North Korea, another communist country, where believers in Christ suffer the harshest persecution and punishment, under a dictatorship even more closed and cruel than Cuba's. By February 1995, my mother finally, after a long wait, went to the U.S. Interest Section office to apply for paternal citizenship, since my grandfather was born in Key West, USA, and died in Cuba in the 1970s. Her request was approved. She took her oath and then filed a family reunification petition for her 2 single sons who remained in Cuba, since one of them had already made it to the U.S., after traveling from Russia to New York with an invitation letter and qualifying under the Cuban Adjustment Act. It was that brother of mine who was able to send us the original birth certificate of our maternal grandfather and paid for the processing and the plane tickets. In September, my older brother and I, both single at the time, were granted the U.S. visa, and by December, we were able to travel to the U.S., after a long wait for the Cuban government to give us the exit permit. They wait until the very last moment, knowing the visa is only valid for 3 months. If it expires, you must reapply and repay the fees. It was a long wait, and just when the 3 months were about to expire, I was finally granted the exit permit, the last one to receive it. Since September, I had been trying to find buyers for our furniture, appliances, and household items, to sell everything I could and leave the regime with the bare minimum. When people leave the country permanently, the government audits everything they own and requires it to be turned over, along with the house, even if it's owned and paid for, to the thieving and plundering tyrannical government. But I sold everything, even the front gate and the apartment water heater, which belonged to the building and wasn't even ours. We left only a couple of beds, an old sofa, a table with 2 chairs, a black and white TV, a few utensils, and a couple of pots. But we had quite a lot of things. In fact, we had 3 refrigerators, 3 TVs, a washing machine, and a landline phone, but we left none of that to the tyrant. Such is the harsh and unjust life of a Cuban on the island. That's why I won't be silent, even if they try to silence me. I will denounce the abuse wherever and however I can, because I cannot stand oppression. And to anyone who wants to tell me stories about the wonders of socialism or what the political left offers, I have more than enough answers and arguments. I am a living testimony, and almost 30 years of Castro's communism were enough for me to know what socialism really is in any of its phases, doctrines, branches, or applications. I know how it begins and how it ends, if it ever ends, because when a communist or socialist leader takes power and manages to consolidate control, that's when an eternal dictatorship begins with no end in sight. But God is in control of the universe and all creation, everything has its time. He allows evil to break us and teach us a lesson, so that the people return to Him, as the Cuban and Venezuelan people are beginning to do, even if they remain submissive to their regimes. In my book, The Cuba Case and the Stockholm Syndrome, I explain how God's timing is fulfilled in the prophecies for Cuba, the reasons behind Cuba's suffering, and the hope that remains for us. The book is available in online bookstores. But it is up to us Cubans to fight for our freedom and not wait for someone else to do it, crying out to God and not participating in the fruitless works of darkness, nor consenting to or being complicit with the communist regime. It is written in 2 Chronicles 7 verse 14. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Since I left Cuba, I have never returned. I cannot conceive of having to pay $400 for a passport that takes 6 months or more to process, and then wait for the Cuban government to authorize me to enter my own country of birth. Nor do I in any way contribute to supporting the dictatorship by spending my money there. I do not criticize those who do, because family comes before pride, but my parents have already passed away, and only cousins remain in Cuba. The collapse of the Soviet bloc. At the beginning of the 1990s, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had recently come to power in the USSR, launched his policy of glasnost, openness. The idea was to apply capitalist principles to the Soviet economy. As expected, in a context lacking the proper infrastructure to accommodate such a system, the Soviet bloc, whose member states had long been in deep crisis, collapsed like a house of cards. From the start, Fidel Castro was opposed to anything resembling perestroika in Cuba and received full support in this from the Communist Party of Cuba, PCC. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, it had a devastating effect on the Cuban economy. The USSR had been providing Cuba with $6 billion in annual economic aid, plus $1 billion in military aid and 10 million tons of oil, in exchange for Cuban sugar, according to an agreement. Additionally, Cuba imported goods from the USSR worth $6 billion. All of this came to a sudden halt in 1991. Cuba was suddenly forced to sell its main export, sugar, at normal market prices, not at the inflated prices the USSR had paid. The sudden shortage of fuel paralyzed industry and transportation. To make matters worse, the sugar harvest that year was terrible. Despite all these difficulties, the government continued to reject opening measures, so it had to adopt a strategy to ensure the survival of the population and the country, the so-called special period in time of peace. Energy consumption was drastically reduced, animal traction replaced vehicles in agriculture and transportation. Food rations were reduced to such extremes that they barely covered the population's minimum nutritional needs. As an additional measure, the government imported millions of Chinese bicycles, which were distributed to the population to alleviate the transportation problem. Since then, Cuba has been in a state where everything seems to be falling apart and time has stood still. Buildings deteriorate without resources to repair them, electric and telephone lines, water and gas supply, everything has been affected by this period of scarcity. Everyday items in other countries, such as toothpaste, toilet paper, bars of soap, light bulbs, or bed sheets, are rare and precious in Cuba. The first signs of opening. These circumstances forced the Cuban government to adopt a series of opening measures which, although they began timidly, steadily progressed in what the government itself called the rectification process of errors. This was supposedly not a change in socialist policy but rather a revision of it in light of its roots, based on the thinking of José Martí. It implied identifying and correcting the errors made over the past decades. This tendency aimed to gradually resolve the main mistake the Cuban regime made during the 2 decades following the revolution, the adoption of the Soviet model, which had already proven to be completely ineffective in its own context, let alone in the vastly different cultural environment of Cuba. The Soviet system was nothing more than a forced graft onto a landscape to which it did not belong, ultimately driving the revolution to a dead end and forcing a retreat in search of new paths. Thus, in 1991, some of the restrictions on foreign travel were lifted, numerous political prisoners were released, and the margin of freedom of expression was broadened. In economic matters, a measure was taken that marked the beginning of partial capitalist reform. Farmers were allowed to operate independently and sell part of their production in free markets, the so-called agricultural markets, created in 1994. This also made it easier for the population to access food, though at much higher prices than those set by the ration book. In 1993, private commercial activities were legalized, and self-employment licenses were granted for more than 100 different professions: mechanics, vendors, hairdressers, taxi drivers, restaurant operators, the well-known paladas, etc. However, these licenses were accompanied by restrictive measures to prevent excessive enrichment among those who practiced them and were subject to very high tax rates. The social philosophy of the revolution could not allow the rise of economically well-off classes. At the same time, however, these economic liberalization measures were necessary for the survival of the country's economy. For this reason, in an attempt to maintain social principles, the government imposed strict measures to prevent self-employment from leading to income levels much higher than average, which would imply the creation of social classes based on wealth. Inevitably, though, this liberalization led to social inequalities that the state was unable to effectively counter. The massive promotion of tourism, which in 1995 became the country's main source of income, exacerbated this situation. Among Cubans, countless activities emerged aimed at generating income directly from tourists, room rentals, taxi services, tour guides, artisan markets, and many more joined the activities initiated in 1991. There was also a resurgence of genetarismo, Cuba's version of prostitution, focused on tourism, despite many efforts by the state to curb it. In search for investors, Cuba increasingly began seeking new investment partners, especially for the creation of joint ventures, mainly in the tourism sector. Special attention was given to Canada, Mexico, and European countries. These measures aimed to compensate for the loss of Soviet subsidies and to counter the U.S. embargo. All these countries were, at that time, investing millions of dollars in Cuba, not only in the tourism industry but also in nickel mines, oil extraction, sugar production, and more. In 1993, a measure was implemented that represented a significant change in the country's economy, the legalization of the U.S. dollar. This became a decisive factor in creating inequality, as the population was now divided between those who had access to dollars and those who didn't. In Cuba, approximately half of the population has relatives abroad who help them financially. One of the main sources of dollars came from the black market, illegal economic activities, and genetarismo, in addition to remittances from relatives living abroad. Those who had access to dollars saw a significant improvement in their standard of living since dollar stores had everything available. The percentage of Cubans with access to dollars at that time was estimated to be around 50% in Havana, although in some other regions, it dropped to as low as 30%. The U.S. embargo on Cuba was further strengthened during that decade with the passing of the Cuban Democracy Act in 1992, the famous Torricelli Act, and the Helms-Burton Act in 1995. The initial U.S. stance toward Cuba was due to Cuba being both a strategic threat and causing significant harm to U.S. interests on the island. However, the strategic threat had disappeared, after the missile crisis, and the focus turned to the nationalizations and expropriations carried out by the Cuban government. Special period. The special period in times of peace, in Cuba was a long period of economic crisis that began as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and, by extension, the collapse of Comecon, as well as the tightening of the U.S. embargo beginning in 1992. The economic depression brought on by the special period was particularly severe in the early to mid-1990s. Cuba's GDP shrank by 36% between 1990 and 1993. A recovery began in 1994, with the GDP returning to similar levels as in 1990 by the year 2007. The special period was initially defined by severe restrictions on hydrocarbon supplies in the form of gasoline, diesel, and other fuel derivatives, which Cuba had previously obtained through its economic relations with the Soviet Union. This period transformed Cuban society and its economy, leading to urgent agricultural reforms, a decline in automobile use, and the need to adapt industries, healthcare, and rationing systems. Changes in production models. The effects of the special period were sudden. The shipments of crude oil agreed upon with the Soviet Union ceased after 1991, and during the following year, Cuba's economy experienced serious restrictions on imports. Petroleum imports fell to just 10% of previous levels. The estimated GDP in 1990 was $31.1 billion, but by 1993 it had fallen to only $19.8 billion. Cuban President Fidel Castro appeared on national television, warning the population about the imminent energy shortage, after receiving notification from Russia that it had no intention of honoring the agreements previously signed by the Soviet Union. Agriculture and relocalization. This fuel shortage especially affected agriculture, which required fuel for tractors, harvesters, and other machinery, as well as Cuba's industrial capacity. The early stages of the special period were marked by general disruptions in transportation and the agricultural sector, along with a decline in the use of fertilizers and pesticides, both mostly derived from petroleum, and widespread food shortages. However, full-scale famine and its worst effects were avoided. Australian permaculture experts and others from around the world came to Cuba to assist and teach their techniques to local farmers, who quickly began implementing them in fields throughout the country. Organic agriculture was soon mandated by the Cuban government, replacing the traditional industrialized method of farming. The relocalization promoted by permaculture, along with innovative approaches to transforming the sector, had to be developed very rapidly. Sugar production needs were drastically reduced, as the Oil for Sugar program with the Soviets had ended, prompting Cuba to quickly diversify its agricultural production, converting sugarcane fields into plots for growing fruits and vegetables. Livestock. Cuban farms' dependence on fossil fuels affected the production of meat and basic goods, which were reduced in the national diet. This led to the need to adopt diets higher in fiber, fresh produce, and ultimately, vegan formulas. Transportation. Alternative transportation methods had to be devised, including the introduction of camels, long, trailer-like buses pulled by truck cabins. In addition, hundreds of thousands of bicycles filled the streets to compensate for the fuel shortages. So-called bicytaxis also emerged, three-wheeled bicycles adapted to carry 2 passengers and 1 driver. The more advanced models were equipped with Soviet vehicle gearboxes adapted to work not with combustion engines but with the pedaling of the bicytaxi operator. Other pre-existing forms of transportation were also redeveloped, such as horse-drawn carts consisting of benches on both sides and space for 8 to 12 people, pulled by 1 or 2 horses. At the same time, the severe economic crisis of those years caused the complete halt of construction on the national highway, which at that point covered only 49% of the country. Additionally, the shortage of materials made it impossible to effectively maintain most infrastructure, causing the progressive deterioration of roads, bridges, railways, and aqueducts. Minerals and metals. Cuba also had to face a drastic reduction in the importation of steel and other mineral-based products, leading to the closure of refineries and factories across the country. This eliminated a significant portion of the state industry and millions of jobs. Tourism, remittances, and new sources of income. The Cuban government was also forced to adopt new strategies to make tourism more profitable. It reached agreements with several nations in Western Europe, especially Spain, and South America in an attempt to earn the foreign currency needed to replace lost Soviet oil through access to international capitalist markets. Meanwhile, the depreciation of the Cuban peso after the crisis meant that those with relatives abroad, when receiving remittances, gained significant income and economic stability. Changes in economic models. Remittances, tourism, the underground and informal economy, underemployment, and the need to relocate productive processes due to the lack of energy resources led the Cuban government to implement profound changes in how it planned its economy and commercial relations. To tackle the crisis, constitutional reforms were made in 1991, which primarily gave rise to 2 emerging economic sectors parallel to the state sector, as well as a dual currency system. On the one hand, the internal market was reopened using local currency, and on the other, a market for imports and national production was established using foreign currency. During the special period, Cuba transitioned from a centrally planned socialist model to a decentralized socialist market model. In 1992, constitutional provisions prohibiting private ownership of the means of production and restricting economic planning were amended. Tourism, remittances, and foreign investment. The Cuban government sought to attract remittances, foreign investment, and tourism by decriminalizing the possession of foreign currency. Partial dollarization reduced currency risk in the newly emerging sectors of the economy, encouraging foreign investment. Additionally, a currency exchange market for the population, CADICA, was created so the state could capture earnings from remittances and tourism, thus improving the supply of goods and services. Dollarization also helped establish a reliable framework of prices and costs, which served to introduce market mechanisms into the business sector. Decentralization of economic and productive planning. Priority had to be given to agricultural production and other processes related to local and community self-sufficiency through the destatization of land, the liberalization of self-employment, and the authorization of several private markets for agricultural, industrial, and artisan products. To accomplish this, the Cuban government destatized large amounts of land to convert them into cooperatives and decentralized the national banking system. Initially, the traditional sector traded in national currency, but to increase self-financing and competitiveness, these sectors were later allowed to operate in the internal market using foreign currency for intrabusiness transactions and the sale of goods and services to the population. In the long term, this also reduced the need for state subsidies. Nutritional intake dropped from 2845 kilocalories per day in 1989 to 1863 kilocalories per day in 1994. The minimum recommended for an adult human is between 2,100 and 2,300 calories. It was estimated that children and elderly people receive only about 1,450 calories per day. According to Franco and colleagues, 2007, each Cuban adult lost between 5% and 25% of their body weight during the 1990 to 1995 period. Due to a likely combination of nutritional and toxic factors, an epidemic of optic neuritis and nutritional peripheral polyneuropathy emerged in the population. Sporadic cases first appeared between 1991 and 1992, and the disease progressed exponentially until May 1993, when there were 30,000 patients. From then on, the Cuban government distributed free vitamin supplements. By 1997, the total number of reported cases had reached 56,800 since the start of the crisis. Diseases of civilization. With the malnutrition during the special period came epidemics, but on the other hand, there were positive effects regarding other diseases associated with modern civilization. In an article published in the American Journal of Epidemiology, Franco, 2007, presents data showing that, during the period from 1997 to 2002, there was a decrease in deaths attributed to diseases of civilization such as diabetes, 51%, coronary heart disease, 35%, stroke, 20%, and other causes, 18%. According to Franco, this was due to how the population sought to reduce energy storage without decreasing the nutritional value of their food. Maternal and infant mortality. Among the major negative consequences, according to the Canadian Medical Association Journal, CMAJ, was a 60% increase in the maternal mortality rate due to common obstetric complications, and a 43% rise in the total maternal mortality rate. On the other hand, the infant mortality rate in Cuba was mitigated by a decrease in birth rates due to poverty, an increase in unofficial abortions, wider distribution of contraceptives, and the very exclusive level of attention that the Cuban healthcare system gives to infants. Mortality among the elderly. According to the American Journal of Epidemiology, there was a modest increase in the all-cause mortality rate among the elderly. Meanwhile, the Canadian Medical Association Journal reported that in Cuba, the consequences included up to a 20% increase in the mortality rate among the elderly between 1982 and 1993. Other effects. The CMAJ criticizes Franco's publication in the American Journal of Epidemiology for not accounting for other impacts on the population, such as mental and social effects, arguing that the hunger experienced in Cuba during the special period was caused by political and economic factors typical of authoritarian regimes under extreme rationing. This same situation forced the Cuban government to accept donations from the United States in the form of food, medicine, and cash. After the special period. Stage 1995 to 2011. As the country began to visibly recover from the shock caused by the collapse of its main economic supporter, Castro emphasized the success of having maintained several social indicators at levels comparable to first world countries, such as education, low infant mortality, high life expectancy, etc. The end of the special period was gradual, from 1995 to 1997. In 1995, the Foreign Investment Law was enacted, which attracted private capital that improved the island's economy. During these years, the nation overcame major obstacles as a society in ruins. It's worth noting that a similar situation occurred in North Korea, a communist regime, where the worst outcomes of the crisis were seen, with 10% of the population dying from hunger and widespread malnutrition throughout the country. With the arrival of Hugo Chavez to the presidency of Venezuela in February 1999, Cuba found in Venezuela an important partner who provided extraordinary benefits through preferential trade agreements. These included receiving more than 100,000 barrels of oil per day at subsidized prices, to be paid on credit over several years. The oil was resold to other countries at international prices, allowing Cuba to obtain billions of dollars to cover expenses in education, health, and food services it could no longer maintain through the socialist system. These oil shipments extended to other left-leaning or centrist governments that emerged in Latin America throughout the following decade. Additionally, the special period served as a catalyst for Cuba to push toward more responsible consumption of its resources. This was reflected, among other things, in the so-called energy revolution, which aimed to achieve a balance between energy production and natural resources through various measures, such as replacing incandescent light bulbs with low-consumption ones, subsidizing low-energy appliances, etc. Since 2003, the GDP has grown continuously, according to reports from ECLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2006, the economy grew by 12.6%, the highest growth in Latin America that year, according to ECLAC. It grew by 7.6% in 2007 compared to the previous year. During 2009, ECLAC estimated a year-over-year GDP increase of 1% compared to 2008, despite the global stock market crisis in January 2008 and the fact that the country was severely affected that same year by 3 powerful hurricanes. In April 2011, the 6th Congress of the ruling Communist Party of Cuba was held, after which a new stage of economic, technological, and social reforms began, reforms that continue to this day. 21st century, Cuba today. Since I left Cuba at the end of 1995, I cannot say for certain what life is like on the island in this new millennium, that is, since the year 2000. For that reason, I rely on the testimonies of other people who still live in Cuba. I still have friends and cousins there. With most of them, I don't communicate much, because they don't have internet access, or it's too expensive for them to use it, whether on a phone or computer, unless I call them. But not all Cubans have the luxury of owning a phone either. Even those I do stay in contact with don't dare speak or express themselves freely, because Cubans live in fear, a fear instilled in them from birth. It's always been rumored that the government listens to calls and knows what people say and think by tapping phones or monitoring citizens' online accounts. They fear repression. Even if it doesn't always go to the extent of imprisonment for opinions, people are afraid of getting into trouble. That's why the government feels secure, because even though its citizens are angry, they can't express themselves or do anything. They are sedated, anesthetized, coerced, intimidated, and in a way, also compromised, whether willingly or by force. That's why the vicious cycle doesn't end, it passes from generation to generation. People are left with only 3 choices: adapt, take risks, or emigrate. However, many of those who emigrate still live in fear because they leave family behind on the island and worry about them, or they don't want to face problems when trying to return to visit. When I've tried to talk to my fellow countrymen on the island, they warn me not to speak about politics. To discuss anything that could be compromising, even business matters outside what the regime permits, they have to speak in code, like spies or the military. It's sad but true. The Cuban, both inside and outside of Cuba, has not only been stripped of their freedom, but also fears being free to express themselves, to think differently, to offend their oppressor, to speak the truth, to have an opinion, or to complain. That, among many other reasons, is why I left Cuba, because I love freedom and cannot stand imposition. The First 2 Decades of the 2000s. By Hector, an ordinary Cuban. My name is Hector. I am Cuban, and my intention is not to speak ill of any government, but to talk about the situation of the Cuban people. Here, I'll share about the political, social, and religious situation that Cuba has experienced and continues to experience from the year 2000 to the present. With the collapse of the socialist bloc, the so-called Soviet Union, Cuba began to explore different means to survive. 1. Jobs in Cuba. One of those means was private businesses, where the government began issuing licenses for various types of work. My brother and I were among those people. For several years, we ran a beautiful business related to fish farming. But like all of us who had private businesses, we couldn't find supplies or food, etc. I remember when I started, it was before 2000, in the middle of the special period, I tried to find food to buy and sell at my sales point. They began selling me wide-mouthed jars of feed at extremely inflated prices, extremely high. I obtained everything that way until I found direct suppliers. Then I invested, and just a few days later, a new law came down saying we couldn't sell fish in plastic bags, or fish tanks made of glass, or this or that, and we had to shut down the business. I was also involved in other private jobs, and it was always the same story. The government gives you a license but limits you, because to operate a private business, you often have to acquire things by other means, and as a Christian, I shouldn't do that. We went through a lot, and the government made a lot of money off of us Cubans. The Cuban government rose thanks to the private sector, because Cuba lost everything. It abandoned the industries that truly generated money, agriculture, sugar, and salt. A country surrounded by sea, filled with fertile land, yet it began to import and spend on sugar, rice, salt, and other items from foreign countries. Cuba had a naval fleet divided into two branches, the merchant marine and the fishing fleet, aside from the military navy. They didn't have great ships, but they managed, and many workers benefited from them, even though Cuban merchant sailors and fishermen were known abroad as beggars and poor people. A merchant sailor earned $2 a day and had to save little by little to buy something after months. They also had restrictions like, forbidding to bringing in of motorcycles, cars, or motorbikes. Every many years, they were allowed to bring certain items, like a refrigerator, a VCR, etc. If they went over the limit, the electronic items were confiscated. The same applied in other areas like clothing, and so on, all with limitations. Around 2000 or shortly after, a man was appointed who merged the two fleets, creating a very difficult situation for sailors and the country. He began selling the ships, and sailors had to risk their lives sailing on faulty vessels. One such case involved a family friend who went on a trip on a ship only suitable for the Caribbean but was sent much farther. During the voyage, the ship began to sink, and only one person survived. Many more cases like this happened, ships detained in foreign ports along with their crews due to the country's deaths. Sailors were sleeping on the decks because of the heat, and others were freezing when fuel ran out during detention. And once the Cuban government managed to pay, those ships were released. They also began flying sailors to and from foreign ships, still receiving the same pay as before. Life was very hard for those sailors who started and lived through that period. Since things are easier now for the new generation, they earn more. Many of those early sailors also faced injustice, some of them held positions like nurses or stewards. The most ridiculous thing is that one person had to perform several roles for the same salary. I share this true story to make a point. After so much sacrifice, these two positions were eliminated, leaving these merchant sailors jobless. They did not accept it quietly and took the matter to court. The trial revolved around the position of steward, administrator, which was eliminated, and the nurse role was handed over to doctors who had never worked in maritime service. You might think, well, a doctor is more qualified than a nurse. Wrong. These nurses had studies in advanced development far beyond those of regular nurses and doctors, because in the middle of the sea, with no one else around in moments of danger, they had to find a solution and even perform surgeries alone, without a nurse or assistant, just one man per ship. The court process lasted several years, and in 2007 they won, somewhat, because they were sent back to sea, but in 2008 they were eliminated. I see how Cuba denounces the embargo and complains that the UN does nothing despite only 2 or 3 countries opposing it. But if Cuba treats its own people like this, how can it criticize others? The Bible confirms it in Matthew 7 verses 4 to 5. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite! First, remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Continuing with the topic of jobs, I'll share that I worked at a Joven Club, Youth Computer Center, as a technician and IT instructor. Days before I started, the water pump had been stolen, but that didn't stop me from beginning. I felt very good despite the difficulties, because I have three things that are very precious to me: first and foremost, the things of God, then family, Christian brothers, and friends, and third, anything related to computing. During the years I was there, the water pump was never fixed or replaced. Drinking water came from the neighbors. We had no lunch, no snacks, no dinner. We worked double shifts and rotated on weekends. On Mondays, we had to clean up because there were and still are no janitorial staff in the Joven clubs, at least not in the ones I know. The double shift schedule ran from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., and if the instructor was late or didn't show up, we had to keep working until the director or another teacher showed up. The second shift went from 5 to 10 p.m. Many times, I was alone, giving classes, watching over 2 other classrooms, the phone, and the front door, all for a salary of 331 Cuban pesos. We had no internet access. To use the restroom, male staff had to go out behind the Joven Club and make sure no one was watching to relieve themselves. I eventually left that job and, months later, went back to private work, with the same obstacles. In 2017, I started working at a technical school specializing in computer science. The first thing I did was meet with the director and have an honest conversation about what I could and couldn't do. Everything went very well. He was a good director, and to this day, maintains his leadership as it should be. The students respect him, and so do the teachers, because he respects others and demands respect in return. The computer lab had 12 computers, but only 2 or 3 were working. I quickly said, let's get this lab up and running, and the first thing the previous technicians, teachers, and even the director told me was that they no longer knew how to get the company Copextal to come repair the computers, because only they had the authority to do so, and they hadn't come in about 2 years. I immediately said, I have a God who will help me. I started making arrangements, and within 3 months, I managed to get them to show up. God is with us, and the most important part of this is not that I'm the best or anything like that. All the glory belongs to God, and what we must do is work with love and excellence. That made a difference, and even though I couldn't continue due to health problems, they still asked me to come back. During the time I was there were also food issues, and in the last few months, the refrigerator broke. So, we had no drinking water. I was earning about 400 pesos a month, from which I had to pay for things required at the workplace, plus transportation. In the end, when I did the math, I was left with about 100 pesos, the equivalent of 4 Cuban convertible pesos, or dollars. You can draw your own conclusions. When I finished that job, I went out to sell sweets whenever I could. Now the salary has increased from 400 to about 1,000 pesos, but I'm not in a condition to work for the state right now. Other Cubans face the same problems, they are widespread across all jobs. Some jobs also make promises they never fulfill. A very close acquaintance of mine worked as a security guard. He and his group were promised that if they cleared an area full of brush and cleaned it up, young fish, would be placed there, and when the fish grew, they would be sold, and each group member would receive 150 to 200 Cuban convertible pesos. In Cuban pesos, that's 3750 to 5000 pesos at present time. They were thrilled and even worked on their days off until the area was completely cleaned up. Days and months passed, and it was all a lie. In the same job, they were also supposed to receive a bag containing various food items. They got 2 or 3 small things, and the rest never came. Eventually, many of them quit that job. Here they always proclaim that there's work for everyone, and yes, it's true, but it's slave labor, not dignified labor. In Cuba, there's theft on every level, as they say, the government steals, the managers steal, companies steal, and even employees steal whenever they can. 2. Healthcare in Cuba. This is another very serious problem here. We're often referred to as a medical power, but in reality, that only applies to how Cuba presents itself internationally. A few doctors always stand out here in Cuba and are very good, especially when they are Christians. I haven't had good experiences with most doctors, and I'll explain my health journey here. I've been an athlete since childhood, a high-performance one, and because I didn't like boarding schools, I gave up 2 good sports. One time when I was young, I was playing street basketball, one of the many sports I played, and I broke a tooth that day. I had a root canal, TPR, and a reconstruction. That reconstruction later fell out, so eventually, I got a post installed, which also came loose. In the end, after a lot of struggles, I managed to get it fixed. Another doctor pulled a tooth and broke the one next to it. Another did a gum cleaning and left a hole in one of my teeth, and there's more. In 2007, I developed a stress-related condition, and a specialist gave me medication that made things worse. I ended up taking so many pills for a total of 6 years, but thank God, in 2012 I started healing, and today I'm doing great, all to the glory of God. In 2017, I discovered a lump in my lower gum and another on the upper gum where the post was placed. They did another root canal on a tooth, and the lower lump disappeared, but the issue with the upper gum turned out to be much more serious and is still being treated today. The dentists discovered that my previous treatment had never been completed, and they had placed the post anyway. I had to start treatment all over again. Pain came and went. To remove the post, they had to drill it out because it had been glued with some extremely strong adhesive and wouldn't come loose even with force. Eventually, more root canals followed, and I was referred to for surgery. My mother took the X-rays and prescription to the specialist at the hospital, who said everything had been done incorrectly. I began seeing 2 different doctors, one using laser treatment and the other restarting the root canal. That was back in 2019, near 2020, and I'm still undergoing treatment, all due to poor work done when I was about 18. I'm now 43, and in a new X-ray taken for that same issue, it showed that the septum on the side of the problem appeared to be fractured. Only God has sustained me and given me the strength to keep going. I believe in miracles, but I know God acts when He decides. In the Bible, there was a servant of God named Timothy, to whom God said, "No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments." 1 Timothy 5 verse 23. That means God healed many, but there were others He did not heal. Why? Those are mysteries of God. We simply must trust and know we are in His hands. There are no medications, and there aren't enough supplies for doctors to work at 100% effectiveness. And if I keep telling stories, I will never finish this part. 3. Transportation in Cuba. The transportation issue in Cuba is not new, and not all the blame falls on the government. Most of the Cuban population is neither mentally prepared nor educated to take care of the buses. Many have gone through schooling, but it seems like school passed through them rather than the other way around. There's a lack of ethics and morals, and not even the CDRs, Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, function anymore. They only do what suits them and are often the worst offenders. Nowadays, it feels like a return to the special period, only under a new name, the current situational phase. 4. Food and everything else. Cubans survive on foods that contaminate the body, synthetic products, and many times, not even those are available. I've seen how in other countries, contaminated foods are removed from store shelves. But here, when chicken arrives at the market, it's thrown on the floor to separate the pieces from each other. There's no refrigeration area, the meat sits outside for 2 days in the open air, and the people rush to the store that same day just to get it before it disappears. In the stores, there are items, but they're far too expensive for the average Cuban. My mother got sick, and a small pack of chicken costs a minimum of 3.50 Cuban convertible pesos, which is 87.50 Cuban pesos. A medium-sized pack can cost around 7. 75 Cuban convertible pesos, 193. 75 pesos. At the job I was working, I earned about 400 pesos a month. Do the math. Food, water, electricity, clothing, shoes, sneakers, appliances, transportation, etc., everything adds up. Many times, my mom and I have gone away for an entire day without a single bite of food. But God placed us here in Cuba, and I see no way to leave, even though I wish I could. So, I keep pressing on toward the goal of the heavenly city, that one I know I can reach. What has communism left us? What has communism truly left us? It has left us with poverty, inequality, betrayal, divisions, hate, pain, hunger, exile, lies, and death. It has erased all hopes, dreams, freedoms, and even faith in God for many. Communism destroyed Cuban families, separated generations, brainwashed children, turned neighbors against each other, and converted citizens into mere subjects of a tyrannical regime. It has replaced merit with loyalty to the party, and truth with propaganda. It has crushed creativity, silenced artists, censored writers, and banished thinkers. It has left us with a broken nation, one whose culture, economy, infrastructure, and morality have been corroded. This regime, now spanning over 6 decades, has survived by manipulating international opinion, exporting revolutions, and using oppression disguised as nationalism. Meanwhile, it continues to blame all of Cuba's problems on the U.S. embargo, though the regime trades freely with many countries around the world and receives billions in remittances from exiles and tourism revenue. But the real blockade is internal. It is the totalitarian system that denies Cubans their natural rights, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom to travel, to prosper, to dissent, and to choose their own future. The revolution, once praised as a movement for the poor, has only benefited the ruling elite, those in the highest circles of power. The Cuban Communist Party has become the new aristocracy, enjoying luxuries, special privileges, private hospitals, and imported goods, while the people stand in endless lines for basic food and hygiene products, often unable to feed their families. What kind of revolution forces its citizens to flee at any cost, by land, by air, or across shark-infested waters? What kind of revolution imprisons poets, journalists, artists, and priests for merely expressing their thoughts or demanding their rights? History will judge Cuba's dictatorship not by its slogans, nor by its propaganda, but by its atrocities, failures, and betrayals. It will be remembered for what it truly was, a deception, one of the longest and most devastating in the history of Latin America. Final words. By the author, Milco Baute. This book was not written out of resentment, but out of pain, a pain I share with millions of Cubans who have lived through tyranny, persecution, hunger, and exile. I do not hate my homeland, but I do reject the oppression, the lies, and the corruption that have held Cuba hostage for over 60 years. I pray to God that Cuba will one day be free, that it will no longer be necessary to write books like this to denounce atrocities that many try to hide or justify. I long for the day when Cubans can look at each other without fear, when they can speak their minds, travel freely, create businesses, elect their leaders, and worship God in peace. To those who read this book from the comfort of freedom, I ask that you do not forget Cuba. Support those who fight for truth, for justice, and for the restoration of the Republic. And to those who are still in chains of silence, may this testimony serve as a wake-up call. May you know that the world is watching, and that God has not forgotten you. Cuba deserves to be free. The blood of the martyrs, the tears of the mothers, and the broken dreams of exiles cry out for redemption. May God bless Cuba. May God bless those who resist evil. May God bless freedom and truth. Quotes by José Martí. To conclude this testimony, I'd like to share some quotes from José Martí, quotes that have been twisted by the Cuban regime or taken out of context to serve their own purposes. Martí is perhaps the most quoted figure in Cuba, but it is likely that he would have been imprisoned or even executed under this communist regime for speaking too much truth. Here are some of his statements. About homeland. The homeland belongs to everyone, and it is fair and necessary that no virtue be denied a place within it. May heaven that few remain with their backs on the homeland will be returned. Whatever threatens the homeland makes me tremble, and I only rejoice in what honors and secures it. The homeland needs sacrifices. It is an altar, not a pedestal. It is to be served, not to be used for self-service. Homeland is more than oppression, more than pieces of land without freedom and life, more than a right to possession by force. One does not lie when one carries the homeland in the heart. The homeland is in great need today, and whoever does not come to its aid today is a deserter. A new star should rise when a man falls defending his homeland. We rise for the homeland. It is a crime to rise above it. The homeland is not a wild card that opens and closes at our will. What right to homeland security does he have who has no homeland? For me, the homeland will never be triumph, but agony and duty. There is no happiness without honor and without a homeland. We do not resign ourselves to live without a homeland. Man, outside his homeland, is like a tree in the sea. When one lives without a homeland, not even sunlight is received. The homeland is not the toy of a few stubborn people, but something divine. I prefer to be a foreigner in other homelands than in my own. I will never debase my soul by asking permission to leave, and even less to enter my homeland. As soon as it smells like triumph, patriots fall from the sky. Is water drunk, and it must be paid for, and freedom is wanted but not paid for? The homeland belongs to no one, and if it belongs to anyone, it will be, only in spirit, to the one who serves it with the most selflessness and intelligence. The homeland is the joy of all, and the sorrow of all, and the heaven of all, and not the fee for benefice of anyone. Homeland is humanity, it is that portion of humanity we see most closely, and in which we were born. The homeland is joy, sorrow, and heaven for all, not the fee for chaplaincy of anyone. About human rights. That is the homeland, equity, respect for all opinions, and comfort for the sorrowful. It feels like they are killing my son every time a man is deprived of the right to think. A person is made up of all the rights and opinions of all their children, not just of a single class of them. The full individual enjoyment of the legitimate rights of man can only be diminished by the negligence or excess of those who exercise them. Why resort to means that are stained with blood, when not all the means that enlighten through justice have been exhausted? One must hold with equal and utmost regard both the awareness of one's own rights and respect for the rights of others, and the latter must be felt even more deeply and delicately than the former. Due to the world's pride and injustice, revolution may fall into the hands of men who forget the rights and love of those who placed in their hands the weapons of power and glory. About socialism. Socialist solutions, born of European ills, have nothing to heal in the Amazon jungle. Autocratic bureaucracy will abuse the tired and hardworking masses. Servitude will be unfortunate and widespread. Socialist associations send their professional agitators. A thinker, Herbert Spencer, pointed out the risk certain modern nations run of falling into degrading socialism. Crime does not serve liberty, nor do red hands match white statues. From being a servant of himself, man would become a servant of the state. From being a slave to capitalists, as they are now called, he would become a slave to bureaucrats. A slave is one who works for another who has power over him. Socialist ideology has two great dangers. One comes from confusing and incomplete readings of foreign texts, and the other comes from the arrogance and hidden rage of those who, to rise in the world, pretend to be pathetic defenders of the defenseless in order to have shoulders to stand on. Various authors quotes. A man full of selfishness is a criminal. The oven must be lit so that everyone can bake bread. An ambitious appetite for glory leads only to sacrifice and death, but innate instinct leads to self-preservation and life. It is man's duty to uplift man. It is a true sin not to do what one is capable of doing. He who could have been a torch and chooses to be only a chain is a deserter. Men who take action, especially those whose actions are rooted in love, come to live forever. Talent is a gift that comes with the obligation to serve others, not ourselves. He who uses the power given by voters to commit injustice against them is a thief. Man loves freedom, even if he is unaware of his love for it. His life is driven by it, and he flees where freedom is absent. Happiness does exist on earth and is achieved through the wise use of reason and serenity, knowledge of full harmony with the universe, and frequent practice of generosity. He who receives money to administer on behalf of its rightful owner and uses it for his own benefit or against the owner's wishes is a thief. Voting is the most delicate privilege of all, for it puts at stake not only the voter's interests but also his life, honor, and future. Only those who spread treason, hatred, and death out of resentment for others' prosperity do not deserve compassion. Using for our sole and exclusive benefit what does not belong to us is outright theft. A man who lives in disgrace and without freedom feels as if his clothing were soaked in the mud of the streets. Men are like stars, some generate their own light while others only reflect the brilliance they receive. A full constellation. Some very famous men, all talk and little action, soon disappear. Action is the dignity of greatness. Liberty is the right every man has to be honest, to think and speak without hypocrisy or fear. He who cannot see things in their entirety should not be called radical. The highest hills end in peaks, nations culminate in their men. It is necessary to begin making virtue fashionable. Books comfort us, soothe us, prepare us, and enrich our lives. About education is freedom. I lived inside the monster, and I know it beyond its entrails. Truth awakens only once, and it never dies. A good soul on earth suffers greatly. The people of the world have the rulers they deserve. The deeper my wound, the more beautiful my song will sound. Life on earth is a mortal hand-to-hand struggle between the law of love and the law of hate. The duty of all men is to be where they are most useful. Only tyranny fears the complete rooting of freedom. People can only become truly free if they are truly educated. To educate is to give man the keys to the world, and that means more than achieving independence and love. A child who is incapable of thinking about what happens around him and is content to live without asking questions lives like a man living off the labor of a scoundrel and is on the road to becoming one himself. Someday, there will be a rising of peaceful individuals who will become warriors once, so that neither they nor anyone else will ever have to be soldiers again. A pious spirit can collapse with a single push only when greed is present. In this world, there should be as much honor as there is sunlight. When many men are without honor, there will always be others who carry the honor of many. Culture belongs to humanity and to our country. It is up to us to value it as a birthright. Those who do not conquer their homeland constantly live under exile and the whip of guilt, like small wild animals thrown from one country to another. Anyone who receives money in trust to manage for the benefit of its owner and uses it for their own benefit or against the owner's wishes is definitely a thief. Anything that separates men, anything that divides or groups men into categories, is a sin against humanity. Just as some stones roll down hills, righteous ideas reach their goals despite all obstacles and barriers. At this point, a revolution in society is still needed, one that will not end with the leader's government. We are free not to be unjust, not to be indifferent to human suffering, and not to take advantage of people, of the work created and sustained through the spirit of political association. Thinking for oneself is part of a man's duty. Engaging in something useless when one could do something useful, paying attention to what is simple when one is capable of attempting what is difficult, is absurdly stripping talent of dignity. He who uses office against the voters quickly becomes a thief. May those who long with all their might for a secure homeland conquer it quickly. Rights must be taken without hesitation. They must never be requested, seized, or begged for under any circumstances. When women are moved and offer their help, they are encouraged and applauded. However, when virtuous and knowledgeable women honor the effort with their sweet love, they are invincible. Racist is a very confusing word in the alphabet and must therefore be clarified. Men have no special rights simply because they belong to one race or another. When you say men, you've already included everyone with their rights. Only those who spread treason, fire, and death out of hatred for others' prosperity are ultimately undeserving of pity. Strength comes from the effort of waiting for long periods. Man needs to suffer because when he has no real pain, he is capable of creating it himself. I must admit that, indeed, men talk too much about danger. Like bones to the human body, the axis to complete a circuit, the wing to the bird, and air to the wing, freedom is the essence of life. Whatever is done without that element ends up being considerably imperfect. My poems can please the brave, honestly, my short and sincere poems have the strength of steel that forges swords. In summary, there seems to be a considerable difference between idiots and madmen. Madmen join wrong ideas and thus make wrong propositions, but they also discuss and reason directly from them. Idiots, however, make very few or no propositions and lack reason altogether. Life is a duty because nature is wonderfully beautiful. The deeper a wound is, the more precious a song it can produce. To go ahead of others, one must see further than they do. Ignorance kills nations, and ignorance must be killed. Doing is the best way of saying. Only oppression must fear the full exercise of freedom. Helping those in need is not only part of duty but also of happiness. A people who submits perishes. A just idea that arises triumphs. To govern is nothing more than to foresee. The sincere man has the right to be wrong. Duty must be fulfilled simply and naturally. Freedom is the essence of life. Pain is the salt of glory. Children are the hope of the world. The passionate are the firstborn of the world. A ruler, in a new nation, means a creator. Government must be born of the country. The only law of authority is love. Justice does not diminish courage, rather, it elevates it. Activity is the symbol of youth. Words are great when they ride on reason. Only he who obeys the homeland truly serves it. To forgive is to conquer. He who thinks only of himself does not love the homeland. From a homeland, as from a mother, men are born. That is better than being a prince, to be useful. There is no racial hatred because there are no races. Love will ultimately fill the hearts of men. Trenches of ideas are worth more than trenches of stone. To know how to read is to know how to walk. To know how to write is to know how to rise. To love is merely the way to grow. A people that honors its heroes is strengthened. He who feeds on young ideas always lives young. In America, liberty is a vigorous sprouting. He who knows how to scorn his life will always know how to honor it. Without lofty ideas, no one should expect common respect. The people that want to be free must be free in business. The good of many is preferable to the opulence of a few. Freedom demands prudence, mutual duties require respect. Words are not to conceal the truth, but to express it. What is just, sometimes, due to how it is defended, appears unjust. Everything is joy when fighting for the light of the world. Truth and tenderness are never useless. Do not suffer. The blood of the good is never shed in vain. Honoring the homeland is a way of fighting for it. Let the arrogant cease, and the need to lift up the humble will cease. What must be done at every moment is what is necessary at that moment. Truth is not reasoned, it is recognized, felt, and loved. Teaching is the most beautiful and honorable thing in the world. Greatness lies in truth, and truth is virtue. Whoever fails to do what he is capable of doing, sins. Only virtues bring lasting and serious well-being to nations. Righteous ideas, above every obstacle and barrier, reach achievement. For me, the homeland will never be triumph, but agony and duty. By loving past glories, strength is drawn to acquire new ones. National politicians must replace exotic politicians. Political liberty will not be secured until spiritual liberty is secured. The law of talent, like that of true happiness, is selflessness. Education begins with life and ends only with death. One leaves the earth content when a great work has been done. Words dishonor when they do not carry behind them a clean and whole heart. To go ahead of others, one must see more than they do. Everything has already been said, but whenever it is sincere, it is new. When one serves the homeland well, one has many old friends everywhere. This enthusiastic youth is beautiful. It is right, but even if it were wrong, we would still love it. Youth must exercise the rights they will later fulfill and teach. Without air, the earth dies. Without freedom, as without its own essential air, nothing lives. Talent is to honor oneself with, not to dishonor others. He who has known how to preserve his decorum knows the value of another's and respects it. In justice, there can be no delay, and whoever delays its fulfillment turns it against himself. A selfless leader is a pride of mankind and an eternal guest of the homeland. The freedom of my homeland, I wish to see it arise with wings, not from pools of blood. Only the general exercise of rights frees nations from the rule of the ambitious. Power is nothing more than respect for all manifestations of justice. That is life, not all the good one could do fits into it. The world is a beautiful temple, where all men of the earth fit in peace. Government is nothing more than the balance of the natural elements of the country. The first duty of a man of our time is to be a man of his time. My politics are thus, to leave the honorable idea in the care of the honor of men. If anything ennobles youth, it is respect and regard for the elderly. Men are divided into two camps, those who love and build, and those who hate and destroy. If one is honest and born poor, there is no time to be both wise and rich. Nations have nothing to fear from justice, except those who resist practicing it. No one has the right to freedom who does not make a habit and take pride of respecting the freedom of others. Neither flattery, nor lies, nor uproar truly help a just cause. There is only one true glory, that of the soul that is content with itself. The true man does not ask which side is more comfortable to live on, but which side duty lies on. Love, administered with vigilance, is the only sure way of happiness and governance among men. It feels like they are killing a son of mine every time a man is deprived of the right to think. We work for truths, not for dreams. We work to free Cubans, not to corner them. There must be a certain amount of decency in the world, just as there must be a certain amount of light. Nations that do not know each other must hurry to get acquainted, like those who are about to fight together. Knowing the country and governing it in accordance with that knowledge is the only way to free it from tyranny. Every man is obliged to honor his homeland through both his private and public conduct. Power is almost always climbed to one's knees. Those who rise standing are those who deserve it. Friendship is as beautiful as love, it is love itself, stripped of the charming fickleness of women. Light is not seen, and yet it is truth. Thus, many things are true even if they are not seen. Freedom is very costly, and it is necessary either to resign oneself to living without it or to decide to buy it at its price. He who lacks the ability to govern justly should not govern, for he lacks the ability to persuade. Justice, equality of merit, respectful treatment of man, full equality of rights, that is the revolution. We must give the opportunity for the best to reveal and prevail over the worst. If not, the worst prevails. Freedom never dies from the wounds it receives. The dagger that wounds it gives it new blood. If truth fails in its voice, the word, like a vain firework, will fall silent to the ground in the night. Love grows like pines, grows like palms. And from its heights, the world looks small. In the past, everything was done with fists, now, strength lies in knowledge more than in blows. Verses should not be written just to say one is happy or sad, but to be useful to the world. Youth is the age of growth and development, of activity and vitality, of imagination and momentum. In free nations, rights must be clear. In self-governed nations, rights must be popular. Cowardice causes much harm in this world, so does indecision, so does poetic governance and imported politics. Do not mistreat us, and you will not be mistreated. Respect us, and you will be respected. Steel responds to steel, and friendship to friendship. Exclusive wealth is unjust. Let it belong to many, not to the upstarts, new dead hands, but to those who honestly and laboriously deserve it. A single man is never worth more than an entire people, but some men do not tire when their people do. In these times of counter-politics, it is urgent to stop being ashamed of being honorable. Virtuous politics is the only useful and lasting kind. Nations must have a pillory for those who incite useless hatred, and another for those who do not speak the truth in time. It is not men who create nations, but nations who, in their moment of genesis, often vibrantly and triumphantly embody themselves in one man. That was Bolivar's merit, that he did not tire of fighting for Venezuela's freedom when it seemed Venezuela itself was tired. Nations, like children, need from time to run, laugh, shout, and leap. Political differences do not grant, between courteous and loyal men, the right to distortion, indiscreet acceptance, or voluntary publication of false news. By the law of history, forgiveness may be an error, but vengeance is always a misfortune. Reconciliation is the blessing of nations. No one should die while they can still be useful, and life, like all things, should not be undone except by those who can rebuild it. Science and letters tame the passions bred by politics. It is time for affection to replace hatred in the law of the world. Honor may be tarnished. Justice may be sold. Everything can be torn apart. But the notion of good floats above all and never sinks. Youth are happy because it is blind, that blindness is its greatness, that inexperience is its sublime trust. What a beautiful generation of active youth is. In life, one cannot do everything one desires, and what is left undone resurfaces from time to time like madness. The essential qualities of character, the original and energetic in every man, can be seen from childhood in a deed, an idea, a glance. Unity of thought, which by no means implies the servitude of opinion, is without doubt essential to the success of any political program. The art of politics lies in bending and molding. Only in the essential ideas of dignity and freedom must one be prickly like a hedgehog, and straight like a pine tree. The only force and truth that exist in life is love. Patriotism is nothing but love, friendship is nothing but love. Campaigns are launched for political freedom, they should be launched with greater vigor for spiritual freedom, for the accommodation of man to the land where he must live. Bolivar won sublime battles with barefoot and half-naked soldiers. Everything shook and was filled with light around him. Generals fought beside him with supernatural courage. Generally, man does not achieve lasting well-being in life until after many years of patient waiting and of being good, without ever tiring. We fight as long as there is a reason, for nature has placed in some souls the need for justice, and in others the urge to deny and offend it. As long as justice is not achieved, we fight. All have sought to know the truth, have written in their books that it is useful to be good, and have suffered and fought to be free, in their land, in their thoughts. Words dishonor when they do not carry a clean and whole heart behind them. Words are unnecessary when they do not lay foundations, clarify, attract, or add. Politicians of these times must live in two eras, one of brave dismantling of what is unnecessary, the other, of patient construction of a future society with the remnants of the collapse. America must promote all that unites nations and abhor all that divides them. In this, as in all human problems, prevention is the path of peace. Not desiring everything for oneself, giving something up so all may have an equal share, is a valor that seems heroic, judging by how few prove it. In nations made up of both cultured and uncultured people, the uncultured will govern, by their habit of aggressiveness and resolving doubts with their fists, unless the cultured learn the art of government. Strategy is politics. Nations must live in self-critique, for critique is health, but with one heart and one mind. Bow down to the unfortunate and lift them up in your arms. Our enemy follows a plan, to embitter, divide, and exhaust us. That's why we follow another plan, to elevate each other, to unite, to outwit them, to finally make our homeland free. Plan against plan. To make politics not the art of clinging to government, nor of giving nations momentary brilliance, but of studying their true needs, supporting their instincts, and securing their wealth. Nature is beautiful, life is a duty, and death is not ugly. No one should be sad or cowardly while there are books in bookstores, light in the sky, friends, and mothers. Politics is the art of raising unjust humanity toward justice, of reconciling the selfish beast with the generous angel, of favoring and harmonizing interests for the general good and with virtue in mind. How can governors come out of universities if there is no university in America where the basics of government, the analysis of the unique elements of the American people, are taught? Against solemn reason, nothing. Against the duty to apply the forces nature has put in the mind, nothing. No king above political right, nor above conscience. Above man, only heaven. Freedom needs men of sacrifice, not men who dishonor, weaken, or abandon those ready to sacrifice rationally and usefully, for today's cost and tomorrow's joy. It is time the constructive forces win the colossal human battle over the destructive ones. War, which used to be the first resort, is now the last. Tomorrow it will be a crime. When many men are without honor, there are always others who carry the honor of many within themselves. They are the ones who rise with terrible strength against those who steal from the people their freedom, which is to steal from them their honor. Neither people nor men must be so timid that they fear themselves. Let politics be artistic, by all means. Few sciences require as much art, restraint, study, and good taste. But it must be sincere. Good deeds must be done without summoning the universe to witness. One is good just because, and because one feels joy when good is done or something useful is said. The world is a beautiful temple, where all the people of the earth fit in peace, for all have wanted to know the truth, written in books that it is good to be good, and have suffered and fought to be free, in their land, in their thoughts. Politics is beautiful, though it may seem ugly because of the inevitable self-interest. Its truth lies in the difficult and painful labor of virtuous men to keep the republic safe from those who profit from the sanctity of their duties. Politics must not be the art of bickering, patching, and dealing. Nor is he worthy of his country's trust who cares more about appearing agreeable to his adversaries, for his own security and reputation, than about attempting and achieving every improvement he deems beneficial to his people. Those are heroes, who fight to make nations free, or who suffer in poverty and misfortune for defending a great truth. Those who fight for ambition, to enslave other nations, to gain more power, or to take others' land, are not heroes, but criminals. Politics is not the science of forms, although it often deals with them. Rather, it is the art of fusing the diverse or hostile elements of a nation into peaceful activity. And first, one must intimately know these elements, so as not to attempt anything that might clash with them, but to gradually introduce foreign novelties that can be suitably and usefully adopted. There are crazy people, of course, and they are the ones who say that only what is seen with the eyes is true. As if anyone could see thought, or affection, or what a gray-haired father says to himself in his mind, how he will one day be able to buy horses like silk or velocipedes like light for his son after much hard work. It is absolutely true, with all the honest truth that human speech can bear, with all the scrupulous accuracy of one who considers it a crime to foster political hopes that have no reason to exist, for the petty pleasure of making ridiculous vanity or sordid interest triumph, or of hiding their cloak of easy conflict and comfortable opposition, of long-standing and real weaknesses. And so, if one falls in good company. Honor is joy and strength. Great rights are not bought with tears, but with blood. There is only one beautiful child in the world, and every mother has it. The vile are despised, and the modest and brave are loved with all our innermost being. When one is young, one creates. When one is intelligent, one produces. One does not adapt, one innovates, mediocrity copies, originality dares. Peace comes as a necessary consequence of work, but work cannot be sustained if it lacks the hope of achieving and improving its products. One must be cautious when proclaiming diplomatic victories over another nation, because the crowing can undo what diplomacy has achieved. Politics is the art of inventing a resource for every new resource of the opposition, of turning setbacks into fortune, of adapting to the present moment without sacrificing or diminishing the important ideal pursued, of retreating to gain momentum, of striking before the enemy has aligned his troops and prepared his battle. A nation is not independent when it has merely shaken off the chains of its masters, it begins to be so when it has removed from itself the vices of defeated slavery and, to build a new nation and way of life, adopts ideas radically opposed to the servile customs of the past, and to the memories of weakness and flattery that despotic rule uses as instruments of domination over enslaved peoples. Quotes by Milco Baute on politics. Great men are measured by their principles. Corruption is not only about money, it also involves the degeneration of morality and customs. Don't risk your word with uncertain promises, so they won't speak badly of you later. Collective ignorance breeds chaos. He who knows dignity yearns for freedom. Fanaticism, whether political or religious, makes people more ignorant. Appearances deceive, but not everyone. The best way to help the poor is to teach them to overcome poverty, not to give them crumbs and handouts to keep them poor. Don't wait for the government to lift you from poverty. Improve yourself, strive, and you'll earn your reward. People fall in love with a politician's words regardless of their plans or ideology. When leadership is disastrous, the country becomes violent, and society becomes vulgar. Those who do not respect their constitution do not love their homeland. We live in a time where principles and values have been lost, as well as the concepts of homeland, freedom, dignity, and respect. Corrupt and immoral politicians understand each other, thus, they sympathize with one another. Moral laws make us better people and are necessary for the good of society. Changing or distorting them corrupts humanity further. Debate and differences are part of civilized human nature, but not arrogance. He who negotiates with a dictator is complicit in his dictatorship. 90% truth with 10% lies is still a lie. The greatest fear of the left is that people become informed and reason, therefore, they try to keep us misinformed. The first thing the political left does is control the media and unify power. Fleeing from a dictatorship is not cowardice, but remaining silent is. If you get used to evil, the time will come when it seems like the best thing. Silence in the face of atrocities makes us as complicit as those who commit them. When the leader is wrong, the group is worse. Both ideology and religion always seek to impose themselves. If death threats were considered a first-degree crime, fewer innocent people would die. Some people enjoy impositions, while others are disgusted by them. When a ruler keeps his word, he is a man of his word. When he doesn't, he is just a politician. Anarchists protest sometimes without knowing why. The philosopher loves politics but is an enemy of politicians. What enrages me more than a dictatorship's abuse of people who permit it is the complicity of other governments with it. I hate injustice and abuse, and I am disgusted by those who support them. Fanaticism, whether political or religious, makes people more ignorant. Just as evil has a beginning, it also has an end. If you don't inform yourself well and reason better, you'll be easy prey for deception. Racism exists in every race, nationality, social class, and political party. In today's ideological civil war, there are two kinds of extremist groups, the vicious and the corrupted. Open and declared socialism is bad, but hidden or disguised socialism is worse. Being patriotic is not a virtue of the infamous. What is imposed repulses, and when it repulses, it is rejected. Communist leaders have the gift of manipulation, and their followers, the gift of ignorance. End of the book. Book created by Baute Production, in Tampa, Florida, United States of America. Phone, 813-693-8879.